Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe, as it is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which city you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. There's something about the forest that always feels alive, more than just the rustling leaves and the animals that dwell within. As a park ranger for nearly 20 years, I've always felt a certain kinship with the woods, a comfort in the solitude that others might find unsettling. But there's one stretch of forest that haunts me to this day, a place where the trees seem to watch your every move, and the wind carries whispers that shouldn't be there. It was late October when I was assigned to patrol the north ridge of the park, a remote area known for its dense woods and treacherous trails. This was no ordinary assignment. The North Ridge was avoided by most rangers, and the few who did go there never stayed long. But I was a seasoned ranger, and I didn't put much stock in ghost stories. The first few days of my patrol were uneventful, almost peaceful. The crisp autumn air and the golden hues of the falling leaves made the long hikes bearable, even enjoyable. But on the fourth day, something changed. I woke up to find the forest enveloped in a thick fog, the kind that clings to your skin and muffles every sound. The birds were silent, and the usual scurrying of small animals in the underbrush was absent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I decided to stick to the main trail that day, not wanting to risk getting lost in the fog. The path twisted and turned through the trees, the mist swirling around me like a living thing. The sun, hidden behind a dense layer of clouds, gave little indication of time, and I soon found myself disoriented. The trail, which I had walked countless times before, seemed unfamiliar. The trees closer together, the path narrower and more twisted. It was as if the forest had shifted, rearranging itself. When I wasn't looking, then I heard it a low, guttural whisper that sent a chill down my spine. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of the leaves, but it grew louder, more distinct. The words were unclear, but there was a pleading tone, as if someone or something was trying to communicate with me. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear, "Help me." The voice was barely audible, but it was there, unmistakable. I called out, my voice sounding small and hollow in the fog. "Hello, is someone out there?" There was no response, just the faint whisper that seemed to come from all around me. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I realized I wasn't alone. I continued walking, more cautiously now, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The whispering followed me, growing louder with each step, until it was a constant murmur in my ears. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was insistent, almost desperate. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I came upon something that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the path, was an old, weathered cabin, one that I had never seen before. The wood was dark and rotting, the windows shattered, and the door hung off its hinges. It looked as though it had been abandoned for decades, yet there was something about it that felt wrong. The whispers grew louder as I approached the cabin, almost as if they were urging me to go inside. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place and never return, but curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what was inside. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. The interior of the cabin was as dilapidated as the outside, with broken furniture strewn about and thick layers of dust covering every surface. But what caught my attention was a set of old ranger gear hanging on a rusted hook by the door. It was the same uniform I wore, only this one was faded and tattered. as if it had been there for years. I stepped further into the cabin, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and I had to cover my nose to keep from gagging. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and I could feel a pressure building in my head, like something was trying to force its way into my thoughts. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. A sense of dread washed over me as I realized I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and there, standing in the corner of the room, was a figure. It was a man, or at least what was left of one. His clothes were ragged, his skin pale and translucent, as if he were made of mist. His eyes were hollow, black pits, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. But what struck me the most was the ranger badge on his chest, identical to mine. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. Ghosts weren't real. But the figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes, the whispers now a deafening roar in my ears. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the echo of its presence. The cabin was silent once more, the whispers gone, but the air was still thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. I knew I had to get out of there. I ran out of the cabin, not caring where the trail led, just desperate to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. The fog was still thick, but I didn't stop, my heart pounding in my ears. The image of that figure burned into my mind. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the forest that I finally collapsed, gasping for breath. The fog had lifted, and the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. I looked back at the woods, half expecting to see the cabin standing there, but there was nothing, just trees and the fading light of day. I never told anyone about what I saw that day. Who would believe me, a ghostly ranger haunting the woods, whispering to anyone who would listen? It sounded like something out of a horror movie, not real life, but I knew what I saw, and I knew I would never forget it. I was reassigned to another part of the park soon after, and I never went back to the North Ridge. I've heard other rangers talk about strange things happening in that part of the forest, but I always keep my mouth shut. Some things are better left unsaid, but sometimes late at night, when the wind howls through the trees and the shadows grow long, I can still hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable, and I wonder if the forgotten ranger still out there, waiting for someone to find him, to hear his story, or perhaps he's still searching for a way out of the whispering woods. The North Rim is not a place for the faint of heart. As a park ranger, you get used to solitude, to the silence of the wild, and the feeling of isolation that comes with patrolling remote areas. But there's something about the North Rim, an area so thick with ancient pines and twisted undergrowth, that even the most seasoned rangers avoid. The locals call it the no man's land, a stretch of forest where the boundaries between the known and unknown blur, and where the wilderness itself seems alive, watching you. My name is Steve, and I've been a ranger for nearly 10 years. I've faced down mountain lions, helped lost hikers find their way, and even dealt with the occasional poacher, but nothing prepared me for the events that unfolded during my last patrol on the North Rim. It was mid-November when I was assigned to monitor the area, tasked with investigating reports of strange sounds and unusual animal behavior. Hunters claimed they'd heard guttural growls at night, and some even swore they saw large, shadowy figures moving through the trees. Most dismissed these as exaggerated campfire stories, but there were enough reports to warrant a closer look. I arrived at the North Rim in the early morning, the air crisp and cold, with the first hints of winter beginning to settle in. The trail was overgrown, rarely used, and as I made my way deeper into the forest, a sense of unease crept over me. The trees here were different, taller, older, their trunks thick with moss, and their branches twisted in unnatural ways. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but the beam was swallowed by the thick forest, revealing nothing but shadows. The night wore on, and the sense of being watched grew stronger. I barely slept, my hand resting on my rifle as I lay in my tent, every noise sending my heart racing. But it wasn't until just before dawn that things took a turn for the worse. I was half asleep when I heard a low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It was close to close, and it wasn't the sound of any animal I'd ever heard before. I sat up, grabbing my flashlight and rifle, and slowly unzipped the tent. The air was still, the forest unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing, just the trees and the shadows. And then I saw them, eyes, dozens of them, reflecting the light back at me from the edge of the clearing. They were too high off the ground to be any kind of animal, and they didn't blink or move, just stared at me, unblinking, as if sizing me up. A chill ran down my spine as I realized they were watching me, surrounding me. I didn't wait to find out what they were. I grabbed my gear, packed up as quickly as I could, and began making my way back to the trailhead. The eyes followed me, always just out of reach of my flashlight, moving through the trees like shadows. I could hear them now, the sound of branches snapping underfoot, and that low, guttural growl echoing through the forest. It felt like hours before I finally reached the trailhead, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. I didn't stop until I was back in my truck, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from the north rim, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally got back to the ranger station, I reported what I had seen, but my supervisors dismissed it as stress or fatigue. They told me to take some time off, to get some rest, but I knew what I had seen. Those eyes, those watchers in the wilderness, were real. I've never gone back to the North Rim, and I've never told anyone else about what happened that night. But sometimes, when I'm out on patrol, I can't shake the feeling that I am being watched, that somewhere deep in the forest, those eyes are still there, waiting, watching, and that one day they might decide to come closer. The trail leading up to Dead Man's Peak is notorious among rangers. It's not just the jagged cliffs or the treacherous switchbacks that make it dangerous. It's the stories. They say the mountain got its name for a reason, that the people who disappear up there are never found. Most rangers steer clear of it, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't one of them. But when you're assigned to patrol that area, you don't really have a choice. It was late December, and the park was almost empty. Winter kept most hikers away, and only the most adventurous or the most foolish dared to venture out. I was scheduled for a routine patrol of the northern trails when the call came in. A hiker had gone missing near Dead Man's Peak, last seen 2 days ago. The snow had already started falling, and the temperature was dropping fast. Time was running out. I gathered my gear and set out immediately, hoping to find some trace of the missing person before the storm set in. The hike to Dead Man's Peak is brutal even in the best of conditions, and with the snow piling up, it was almost impossible. The trail was barely visible, buried under a thick blanket of white, and the wind howled through the trees, making it hard to hear anything but the roar of the storm. By the time I reached the base of the peak, the sky was an ominous shade of gray, the kind that warns you to turn back. But I couldn't. Someone was out there, lost, possibly injured, and I couldn't leave them to die. I radioed the station, letting them know my location, and began the climb. The path up Dead Man's Peak is steep and narrow, with sheer drops on either side. The snow made it even more treacherous, and I had to move slowly, carefully, testing each step before putting my full weight down. The higher I climbed, the worse the weather got. The wind whipped snow into my face, stinging my skin and blinding me. I had to stop several times, huddling against the rocks to catch my breath and shield myself from the freezing gusts. That's when I saw a faint glimmer of light in the distance, near the summit. My heart leapt with hope. It had to be the missing hiker. I shouted into the wind, but my voice was lost in the storm. I pushed on, driven by the need to reach that light, to find whoever was up there and bring them back. As I got closer, I realized the light wasn't coming from a flashlight or a campfire. It was too steady, too bright, almost like a lantern, but there was something off about it. The light didn't flicker or waver in the wind, and it seemed to hang in the air, unearthly and unnatural. I felt a chill run down my spine, one that had nothing to do with the cold. The snow was almost knee-deep now, making every step a struggle, but I kept going, my eyes fixed on the light, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the hiker had somehow lit a fire, and I was just too cold and tired to think straight. Then, as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing on the edge of the cliff, was a figure silhouetted against the snow. The light was behind them, casting an eerie glow around their body, and for a moment I thought it was the hiker, but something was wrong. The figure was too tall, too thin, and there was something unnatural about the way it stood, too still, too rigid. I called out, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me, or at least I thought it was. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of its body against the snow. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped between the need to help and the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over me. Slowly, the figure began to move, gliding across the snow toward me, its movements too smooth, too silent. The light followed it, casting long, dark shadows across the ground. I backed away, my boots slipping on the icy rocks, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real, but the figure kept coming, closer and closer, until it was just a few feet away. I could see it clearly now, tall, emaciated form wrapped in tattered clothing, its face obscured by a hood. The light seemed to emanate from within it, casting an eerie glow on the surrounding snow. The air around it was frigid, colder than the rest of the mountain, and I could feel the icy fingers of fear wrapping around my heart. Who are you?" I stammered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, just stood there, watching me with unseeing eyes. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as a sense of utter wrongness filled the air. This wasn't a person, it was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. I took a step back, my foot slipping on the ice, and I nearly fell. The figure didn't move, just watched me, as if waiting for something. The light behind it pulsed, growing brighter, and I had to shield my eyes from the intensity. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, the light winking out as if it had never been there. I was left standing alone on the mountainside, the wind howling around me, the snow swirling in the darkness. I felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a new terror. The path behind me was gone, the snow had covered it completely, and all I could see was a sheer drop on either side. There was no way back, no way down. I was trapped on the peak, alone, with no light, no guide, and the storm closing in. Panic set in. and I fumbled for my radio, my hands numb from the cold. I tried to call for help, but all I got was static, a signal lost in the storm. My heart pounded in my ears, and I felt a surge of desperation. I had to find a way down. Had to get off this mountain before it was too late. I turned back the way I had come, trying to retrace my steps. But the snow was too deep, and the wind had erased any trace of the trail. I stumbled through the drifts, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the cold seeping into my bones. The peak loomed above me, a dark silhouette against the stormy sky, and I felt a sense of hopelessness wash over me. And then I saw it again, the light flickering in the distance, like a beacon in the darkness. But this time I knew better. It wasn't a rescue, wasn't a guide. It was a lure, a trap, something meant to draw me in. I turned away, refusing to follow it, determined to find my own way down. But the light didn't give up. It moved, shifting closer, always just out of reach, always pulling me toward the edge. I could feel its pull, a magnetic force that tugged at my mind, urging me to follow, to let go. I fought it. Every step a battle against the overwhelming desire to surrender, to give in to the light. But the storm was relentless, the cold biting, and I was growing weaker with every passing moment. I don't know how long I struggled against it, how many times I slipped and fell, how many times I thought about giving up. But somehow, by some miracle, I found myself back on the trail, the faint outlines of the path barely visible under the snow. I followed it blindly, not daring to look back, not daring to listen to the whispers of the wind that urged me to turn around. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the faint glow of the ranger station's lights in the distance. I stumbled toward them, my legs barely holding me up, my body numb with cold and exhaustion. When I finally reached the station, I collapsed at the door, too weak to move, too terrified to look back. The other rangers found me there, half frozen and barely conscious. They pulled me inside, wrapped me in blankets, and tried to get me to talk. But I couldn't find the words. I never told them what I saw up there on Dead Man's Peak. I couldn't. They wouldn't believe me, wouldn't understand. They'd think I was crazy, that the cold had gotten to me. But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever it was, it's still up there, waiting, watching. And I know that one day someone else will see the light, will follow it. And they won't be as lucky as I was. They'll disappear just like the others. The Sierra Nevada mountains are a place of unparalleled beauty, with towering peaks and pristine lakes that draw adventurers from around the world. But beneath that beauty lies a darkness, a place where the wild meets the unknown, where things that should have stayed hidden are disturbed. This is a story of one such place, a remote ridge that locals call the Haunted Ridge. My name is Daniel, and I've been a park ranger in the Sierras for over 15 years. I've seen my share of strange things unexplained, lights, eerie sounds, and even the occasional ghost story from a hiker who swore they saw something out of the corner of their eye. But none of those experiences prepared me for what happened on the Haunted Ridge. It started with a missing hiker, a young man, probably in his mid-20s, had set out on a solo trek along a lesser-known trail that led to the ridge. He was an experienced hiker, well-prepared, and had left detailed plans with his family about his route. When he didn't return on schedule, a search was organized. I was one of the rangers assigned to the search party. The trail to the ridge is steep and winding, cutting through dense forest and skirting the edges of sheer cliffs. It's not an easy hike, even for someone in good shape, and it's easy to lose your way if you're not careful. We followed the hiker's last known path, hoping to find some sign of him, footprints, a discarded item, anything. But as we climbed higher, The forest grew darker, the trees closing in around us, and the air grew thick with an unnatural silence. By the time we reached the ridge, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the rocky outcrop. The ridge itself was narrow, with a sheer drop on one side and a thick tangle of trees on the other. The wind howled through the trees, making it difficult to hear anything but the sound of our own footsteps crunching on the gravel. We split up, each taking a section of the ridge to search. I was assigned to the northernmost part, where the trees were thickest and the ground was uneven, littered with rocks and fallen branches. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind. As I pushed through the undergrowth, I found myself thinking about the stories I'd heard over the years, stories of people who had gone missing on the ridge, never to be seen again. Some said the ridge was cursed, that it was a place where the spirits of the dead lingered, unable to find peace. Others claimed that the forest itself was alive, that it watched and waited for those who venture too far into its depths. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the task at hand, but the sense of being watched grew stronger with every step. I stopped to catch my breath, listening to the wind rustling through the trees, and that's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like someone whispering my name. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just the wind, just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just shadows and silence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a flash of movement, a figure darting between the trees. I called out, thinking it might be the missing hiker, but there was no response. I moved toward where I'd seen the figure, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but when I reached the spot, there was no one there, just more trees, more shadows. I was about to turn back when I saw it again, further ahead, a flicker of light, like a lantern bobbing in the distance. I hesitated for a moment, a sense of dread settling over me, that I knew I had to check it out. If it was the hiker, he might be injured, lost, and in need of help. I followed the light, pushing through the thick underbrush, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The light seemed to move away from me, always just out of reach, leading me deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisting together overhead, blocking out the last of the daylight. I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me, but I kept going, driven by the need to find the hiker. Finally, I reached a small clearing, the light hovering just beyond the edge of the trees. I stopped, my heart pounding in my ears, as I realized something was wrong. The light wasn't a lantern, it was too bright, too steady, almost like it was coming from within the trees themselves. And then I saw them figures standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, their faces hidden in shadow. They were too tall, too thin, their limbs elongated and unnatural, like they had been stretched and distorted. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching me with those hollow, empty eyes. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, my instincts screaming at me to run, to get out of there as fast as I could. But I couldn't move, couldn't take my eyes off those figures. It was as if they had me trapped, held in place by some unseen force. Then, slowly, one of the figures stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. It reached out a hand, long and bony, and I could see the skin stretched tight over the bones, translucent and pale. I took a step back, my heart racing, and the figure stopped, its head tilting to one side as if it was curious, studying me. The light pulsed, growing brighter, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, the ground tilting beneath my feet. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in that clearing, staring at those figures, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, something snapped inside me, and I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the branches that tore at my clothes or rocks that cut into my skin. I had to get away, had to put as much distance between me and those things as possible. When I finally burst out of the trees and onto the ridge, the light was gone, the figures vanished, as if they had never been there. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, my body trembling with fear. The other rangers found me there hours later, when the search was called off due to the worsening weather. I tried to tell them what I had seen, but the words wouldn't come out. They just looked at me, their expressions a mix of concern and disbelief. The missing hiker was never found. The official report said he must have fallen off the ridge, his body lost in the dense forest below. But I know the truth. I know what I saw. I've never gone back to the haunted ridge, and I avoid that part of the park whenever I can. The other rangers think I'm just being superstitious, that I let the stories get to me. But I know what's out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too far into the darkness. And I know that the haunted ridge is not just a name. It's a warning, one that I'll never forget. The Blackwater Lake region was notorious for its remoteness. Tucked away in the far reaches of the national park, it was a place few people ventured. The lake itself, named for its deep, dark waters that seemed to swallow the light, was a favorite among seasoned campers and hikers who sought solitude. But it also had a darker reputation, a history of disappearances and strange occurrences that left even the most experienced park rangers uneasy. My name is Jesse, and I've been a park ranger at Blackwater for nearly a decade. I've heard all the stories, the whispers of a ghost that haunts the lake, of campers who vanish without a trace, and of strange lights that dance across the water on moonless nights. Most of the time I could dismiss them as just that, stories. But one night, while on patrol, I learned that sometimes the stories are true. It was early September, the tail end of the summer season. The days were still warm, but the nights had begun to cool, a hint of autumn in the air. The park was quieter now, most of the summer tourists having gone back home, leaving only the hardcore adventurers behind. I had the late shift, patrolling the northern trails that led to Blackwater Lake, making sure the last of the campers were accounted for before nightfall. The sun was just beginning to set when I reached the lake. The water was calm, a mirror-like surface reflecting the fiery colors of the sky. It was beautiful, serene, the kind of place that made you forget the world outside even existed. But there was something else, something that always made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end whenever I came near Blackwater. I checked the campsites along the shore, noting that there were only a few tents set up, most of them clustered near the main trail. I chatted briefly with a couple of campers, making sure they had everything they needed and reminding them to keep their fires small and contained. They were friendly enough, but I could tell they were eager to settle in for the night, to enjoy the peace and quiet of the lake. As I made my way around the far side of the lake, where the trail grew narrower and the trees thicker, I spotted a single tent set up near the water's edge, separated from the others by a good distance. It struck me as odd. Most people preferred to camp in groups, especially in a place as isolated as Blackwater. I decided to check it out to make sure everything was okay. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time I reached the tent, the sky darkening quickly as night fell. The only light came from the fading glow of the sunset and the first few stars appearing overhead. I called out, but there was no answer. I hesitated, a sense of unease creeping over me, but I pushed it aside and approached the tent. "Hello," I called again, louder this time, but still no response. I waited a moment, listening to the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant call of an owl. But there was something else, too, something faint, barely audible, like the whisper of a voice carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I took a deep breath and stepped closer, reaching for the tent flap. It was unzipped, hanging open slightly, and when I pulled it back, I found the tent empty. There was no sign of the camper, no sleeping bag, no gear, nothing. It was as if they had never been there. I frowned, glancing around, but there was no one in sight. The lake stretched out in front of me, dark and still, the water almost black in the growing darkness. The trees loomed tall and shadowy behind me, their branches swaying in the breeze. I radioed the station, letting them know what I'd found. They told me to stay put and wait for backup, but something didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there in the darkness, just beyond the edge of the trees. I stepped away from the tent, my flashlight sweeping across the ground. The beam caught something on the shoreline, a set of footprints leading down to the water's edge. I followed them, my boots crunching on the gravel, until I stood at the very edge of the lake. The footprints stopped abruptly, as if the person had simply walked into the water and vanished. I shined my light across the surface, but the water was too dark, too murky to see anything. I felt a chill run through me, the cold air biting at my skin, and then I saw it, a faint, ghostly light hovering just above the water, near the center of the lake. It was small, flickering like a candle flame, and it moved slowly, drifting across the surface. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a surge of fear, but I couldn't look away. The light grew brighter, more intense, and I could see something moving beneath the water, something large and dark. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the light dot. It was then that I heard the voice again, cleared this time, a soft, mournful whisper that seemed to come from all around me. It was a woman's voice, and though I couldn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakable sadness, longing, despair. The light began to move toward me, slowly at first, then faster, cutting through the water like a knife. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering as I fumbled for the radio. I had to get out of there, had to get back to the station, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The light was almost at the shore now, the water churning around it, and I could see the shape beneath the surface, a figure, pale and ghostly, reaching out toward me with outstretched arms. The voice grew louder, more insistent, as if it was calling me, begging me to come closer. I turned and ran, the radio clutched in my hand, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I was back at the main trail, the other campers' tents in sight. I radioed the station again, my voice shaking as I told them what I had seen. They sent a team out to search the lake, but they found nothing, no trace of the camper, no sign of the light, nothing but the dark, still waters of Blackwater Lake. They chalked it up to exhaustion, told me I was probably just seeing things, but I knew better. I've never been back to Blackwater Lake at night since then, and I don't plan to. The stories were true. All of them. There's something in that lake, something that shouldn't be there, something that's waiting for the next person to venture to close. And if you ever find yourself at Blackwater Lake, alone at night, and you see a light on the water, don't follow it. Don't listen to the voice. Turn around and leave as fast as you can, because if you don't, you might not make it back. There's something about fire towers that's both inspiring and terrifying. Perched high above the treetops, They offer breathtaking views of the wilderness, but they also stand as solitary sentinels in the vast expanse of the forest. For years, these towers have served as vital lookout points where rangers keep watch for wildfires that could devastate the land. But the isolation can get to you, playing tricks on your mind, and sometimes those tricks are more than just your imagination. My name is Travis, and I've been a park ranger for about 12 years. I've worked in various national parks, but my most memorable and most chilling experience was at a fire tower deep in the Pacific Northwest. The tower was located in a remote section of the park, miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a narrow, winding trail that took hours to hike. It was late September, the end of the fire season, and the park was preparing to shut down the tower for the winter. I was assigned to do the final shift, a 3-day stint before closing it up and heading back to civilization. The tower had always felt eerie, even during the day. At night, it was something else entirely. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it scanning the horizon, noting the changing colors of the leaves as autumn took hold. The view from the tower was spectacular, an endless sea of green and gold, the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks dusted with the first snow of the season. As the sun set, the sky blazed with orange and red, casting long shadows across the forest. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. That night, as I settled into the small, cramped cabin at the top of the tower, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the tower creaked and groaned with every gust. I told myself it was just the wind, that the isolation was getting to me, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, soft, almost imperceptible sounds, like someone moving around just outside the door. Around midnight, I finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a loud thud. I shot up, my heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight. The noise had come from the roof, a heavy, deliberate sound, like something or someone had landed on it. I climbed the narrow ladder to the roof hatch, every step filled with dread. The hatch was secure just as I'd left it, and when I opened it and shined my flashlight across the roof, there was nothing there, just the empty expanse of metal, cold and slick with dew. I stood there for a moment, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing unusual. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, sending shivers down my spine. The next day was quiet, but the unease from the night before stayed with me. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner, my eyeshadows flitting between the trees far below, or a dark shape just beyond the edge of the clearing that surrounded the tower. Every time I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. As the sun set on the second day, casting the forest in long, eerie shadows, I decided to radio the ranger station. I didn't want to admit that I was spooked, but something felt wrong. The line crackled with static as I made contact, and I told them about the noises and the strange feeling I had. They brushed it off, saying it was probably just animals, maybe a bear or a cougar, but they agreed to send someone to check on me the next day. That night the noises returned, louder this time. The wind had died down, and the forest was unnaturally still. The only sound was the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. But then, just after midnight, I heard it again, that same thud on the roof, followed by a scraping sound, like claws on metal. I didn't want to go up there again, but I had to. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the ladder, my hands trembling as I pushed open the hatch. The beam of my light cut through the darkness, and for a moment I saw something crouched on the edge of the roof, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It was large, humanoid, but twisted and misshapen, with long, thin limbs, and a face that was more shadow than flesh. I froze, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. The creature stared back at me, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. And then it was gone, leaping off the roof and disappearing into the night. I slammed the hatch shut and bolted it, my heart racing. I knew what I'd seen, but I couldn't make sense of it. It was like something out of a nightmare, something that shouldn't exist. I didn't sleep at all that night. The image of the creature burned into my mind. When dawn finally came, I felt a small measure of relief, though the sense of dread remained. I waited for the other ranger to arrive, counting the hours until I could leave. But when noon came and went with no sign of him, I began to worry. I tried the radio, but all I got was static. The isolation that had once felt peaceful now felt suffocating, as if the forest itself was closing in around me. I paced the small cabin, glancing out the windows every few minutes, half expecting to see the creature again. But it wasn't until late afternoon that I heard the sound of footsteps on the trail. I ran to the window, expecting to see the other ranger, but what I saw instead made my blood run cold. It was the creature standing at the edge of the clearing, its eyes locked on the tower. I stumbled back, my mind racing. The thing had followed me, tracked me to the tower, and now it was just standing there, watching, waiting. I knew I had to get out, but the only way down was the ladder, and that would mean going outside, going past it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into darkness, the creature began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it started to circle the tower, its glowing eyes never leaving me. I could hear its footsteps, soft but deliberate, crunching on the gravel below. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to do something, had to get out of there, but I was trapped. The radio was dead, the creature was circling below, and I was alone. Then the tower began to creak, the metal groaning under some immense pressure. I could hear the bolts and beams straining, as if something was trying to pull the tower down. I knew I had to act fast. Grabbing my backpack and a flare gun from the emergency kit, I made my way to the ladder. My hands were shaking as I climbed down. The flare gun clutched tightly in my hand. The creature was still circling, its footsteps louder now, more urgent. I could feel its eyes on me, its presence oppressive and overwhelming. I hit the ground running, not daring to look back. The trail was dark, the trees closing in around me, but I pushed forward, my legs burning with every step. I didn't know if the creature was following me. I didn't want to know. All I could think about was getting as far away from that tower as possible. I ran for what felt like hours, the forest a blur around me. Finally, I saw a light through the trees' headlights, a vehicle on the road. I burst out of the forest, gasping for breath, and flagged down the truck. It was the other ranger, the one who was supposed to relieve me. I never told him exactly what happened. I just said I saw something I couldn't explain, and that we needed to leave. He didn't ask any questions, just drove me back to the station. I've never returned to that fire tower. They closed it down for the winter, and when spring came, I requested a transfer to a different park. I couldn't stay there, couldn't face the possibility of seeing that creature again. To this day, I don't know what it was, if it was real or just a figment of my imagination, brought on by the isolation and the fear. But I do know one thing. There's something out there in those woods, something dark and ancient, something that watches from the shadows. And if you ever find yourself alone in a fire tower, miles from civilization, remember this: you're not as alone as you think. The old, abandoned mines deep within the national park were something of a local legend. They were relics from the early 1900s, when the area was a booming hub for coal and precious metals. Over the years, most of the mines were sealed off, deemed too dangerous for public access, but a few still remained, hidden away in the dense forest, accessible only to those who knew where to look. My name is Ben, and I've been a park ranger for about 8 years. Part of my job involves patrolling the remote sections of the park, making sure that no one was foolish enough to venture into these forgotten places. The mines, with their collapsing tunnels and unstable shafts, were a particular concern, but it wasn't just the physical dangers that made them off limits. There were stories, passed down from one generation of rangers to the next, about things seen and heard in those dark, underground labyrinths. Most people dismissed them as ghost stories, just another way to keep thrill-seekers out of harm's way. But I wasn't so sure. It was late October when I was sent to check on the old Northridge mine, one of the last remaining open sites. The Park Service had finally decided to seal it off for good, and I was to make sure the area was clear of any trespassers before they began the work. I'd been to the mine a few times before, but only during the day. This time my shift started late in the afternoon, and by the time I reached the trailhead that led to the mine, the sun was already setting. The height to the mine was a steep and winding one, the trail barely visible beneath the thick canopy of trees. As I walked, the shadows lengthened, the light fading to a dull gray as dusk settled in. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as night approached. By the time I reached the entrance to the mine, it was nearly dark, and I had to use my flashlight to see anything at all. The entrance to the mine was little more than a gaping black hole in the side of the mountain, framed by crumbling stone and rusted metal supports. A few old tools and pieces of equipment lay scattered around the entrance, relics from a time long past. The wind howled through the trees, making the whole scene feel even more desolate. I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness, but there was no answer. The area was deserted, as I'd expected. Most people in their right mind wouldn't come near this place, especially not after dark, but something didn't feel right. There was a stillness, an unnatural silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I shined my flashlight into the mine entrance. The beam cutting through the darkness revealed the rough-hewn walls of the tunnel. The air that wafted out was stale and cold, with a faint, musty smell that made my stomach turn. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, to leave this place behind. But I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to let a little unease get the better of me. I stepped inside, the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel echoing off the walls. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for me to stand upright, and the ceiling was so low that I had to duck in places. I kept my flashlight trained on the ground, watching for any signs of recent activity, footprints, discarded trash, anything that might indicate someone had been there recently, but there was nothing. Just the endless tunnel stretching out in front of me, disappearing into the darkness. As I moved deeper into the mine, the air grew colder, and the walls began to close in, the tunnel narrowing even further. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. The sense of unease I had felt at the entrance was growing stronger, a gnawing fear that seemed to settle in the pit of my stomach. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a fork in the tunnel. The main shaft continued straight ahead, while a smaller, narrower tunnel branched off to the right. I hesitated, shining my flashlight down both paths. The smaller tunnel looked barely passable, the walls rough and uneven, the ceiling low enough that I'd have to crawl in places. I didn't want to go that way, but something caught my eye, a faint glimmer of light barely visible, deep within the smaller tunnel. It was the kind of light that shouldn't have been there, not in a place like this. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe another ranger had been here earlier and left something behind, or maybe there was an opening further down the tunnel that I wasn't aware of. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, the light didn't make sense against my better judgment. I turned into the smaller tunnel, moving slowly, cautiously, my flashlight barely illuminating the way ahead. The walls were rough and jagged, scraping against my shoulders as I squeezed through the narrow passage. The light grew brighter as I moved deeper into the tunnel, but there was something wrong with it. It wasn't the warm, golden glow of a campfire or the harsh beam of a flashlight. It was cold, almost bluish, and it seemed to pulse like it was alive. The tunnel curved sharply, and I found myself in a small chamber, the walls closing in on all sides. The light was coming from the far corner of the chamber, and as I approached, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, half buried in the loose gravel and dirt, was a pile of bones, human bones. By the look of them, they were old, brittle, yellowed with age, but there was something strange about them. They were arranged in a circle, as if they'd been deliberately placed there. In the center of the circle was the source of the light, a small, glowing stone, smooth and round, about the size of a marble. The light it emitted was cold, unnatural, and it cast eerie shadows on the walls of the chamber. I stared at the stone, my mind racing. I'd heard stories about the mind, stories about strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances, but I'd never believed them. Now, standing there in that dark, claustrophobic chamber, I wasn't so sure. I reached out, my hand trembling, and picked up the stone. The moment I touched it, the light flickered, and then, as if it was reacting to my presence, the air in the chamber grew colder, the temperature plummeting so quickly that I could see my breath in front of me. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from the tunnel behind me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The growl grew louder, closer, and I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and ran, the stone still clutched in my hand. The tunnel seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in from all sides. The growling followed me, echoing off the walls, getting louder and louder, until it was all I could hear. I stumbled out of the tunnel and into the main shaft, my flashlight flickering as I raced toward the entrance. The growling was right behind me now, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the mine. I didn't dare look back. When I finally burst out of the mine, the cold night air hit me like a slap in the face. I stumbled to a stop, my legs trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The growling had stopped, but the sense of dread of something watching me remained. I looked down at the stone in my hand. The light had gone out, leaving it cold and dark. I didn't know what it was or what it meant, but I knew I couldn't keep it. I tossed it into the woods, watching as it disappeared into the darkness. I radioed the station, telling them the mine was clear, but I didn't mention the stone or the growling. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. The mine was sealed off the next day, and I was glad to see it go. Whatever was in there, whatever was buried deep within those tunnels, was best left undisturbed. I've never gone back to that part of the park, and I avoid old mines whenever I can. There are things in this world that we're not meant to understand, things that should stay buried and forgotten. And if you ever find yourself near one of those old, abandoned mines, do yourself a favor, stay far, far away, because some things are better left in the dark. Being a park ranger is a job that most people romanticize. They picture serene days surrounded by nature, peaceful hikes through untouched wilderness, and quiet nights under the stars. But those who've done the job for long enough know that the wilderness holds secrets, some beautiful, others terrifying. My name is Sam, and after 12 years of patrolling some of the most remote and rugged parts of the country, I've come to realize that not everything can be explained away by logic or reason. It was the summer of 2018 when I was stationed at a remote park in Montana. The park was vast, spanning hundreds of thousands of acres, with dense forests, towering mountains, and deep, winding valleys. Most of it was untouched by human hands, save for a few trails and backcountry campsites. It was beautiful, sure, but it was also isolated, the kind of place where you could disappear and never be found. That summer was particularly dry, and the threat of wildfires loomed over everything. I was part of a small team of rangers tasked with monitoring the backcountry, ensuring that hikers and campers followed the fire regulations and didn't start any accidental blazes. The job involved long days of hiking through rugged terrain, often with little to no contact with the outside world. It was on one of these long patrols that I first noticed something strange. I was deep in the backcountry, miles from the nearest trailhead, when I came across an old, overgrown path that didn't appear on any of our maps. It was narrow and winding, barely visible through the thick underbrush, but there was something about it that drew me in. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to form a natural archway over the path, or the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Whatever it was, I decided to follow it. The path led me deeper into the forest, the trees growing thicker and the light dimming as the canopy closed in overhead. The air was cooler here, the smell of pine and damp earth heavy in the air. As I walked, I began to notice signs that the path had once been well-used, faded blazes on the trees, old, crumbling stone markers half buried in the undergrowth. Even the remnants of a wooden footbridge spanning a narrow creek. After about an hour of hiking, the path opened up into a small clearing, and that's when I saw the remains of an old cabin, long abandoned and overgrown with moss and vines. The roof had collapsed in places, and the windows were dark and empty, like the hollow eyes of a skull. The place had an eerie, forgotten feel to it, as if it had been left to rot in the middle of the forest. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the cabin, my boots crunching on the fallen leaves. The door was hanging off its hinges, creaking softly in the breeze. I pushed it open and stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the dim interior. The place was a mess, broken furniture scattered across the floor, old, tattered curtains hanging in the windows, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. It was clear that no one had lived here for a long time. I was about to leave when something caught my photograph lying on the floor near the fireplace. I picked it up, brushing off the dust, and my heart skipped a beat. The photograph was old, yellowed with age, but the image was still clear. It showed a man and a woman standing in front of the cabin, smiling at the camera. They looked happy, content. But it was the man that caught my attention. He was wearing a ranger uniform, just like mine. I turned the photograph over, and written on the back in faded ink were the words, John and Emily, summer 1954. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew the history of the park, knew that it had been established in the early 1900s, but I had never heard of a ranger named John working here in the 50s. There was no record of him, no mention in any of the old logs or reports. I decided to leave the cabin, but as I turned to go, I heard something, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like someone whispering my name. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper came again, clearer this time, and I spun around, shining my flashlight into the corners of the cabin. But there was no one there, just the wind rustling through the trees outside. I left the cabin quickly, almost running back down the path. The feeling of being watched stayed with me, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But the path was empty, just as it had been when I arrived. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd found. I wasn't even sure what to make of it myself. But over the next few days, strange things started to happen. At night, while I was alone in my cabin at the ranger station, I began to hear noises, soft footsteps on the porch, the sound of something scratching at the walls, whispers in the dark. I would jump out of bed, grab my flashlight, and rush outside, but there was never anyone there, just the empty forest, silent and still. Then, one night I woke to find the photograph from the cabin lying on my pillow. I had left it in my pack, which was in the other room, but somehow it had ended up next to me. My blood ran cold, and I knew then that whatever I had stumbled upon in the woods, it had followed me back. I tried to ignore it, to brush it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, but the occurrences only grew more frequent, more intense. The whispers became voices, indistinct at first, but then clearer, more insistent. They would call my name, beckoning me to return to the cabin, and always there was this sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to go back to the cabin, to confront whatever was haunting me. I don't know what I was expecting to find, maybe some kind of closure, or maybe just proof that I wasn't losing my mind. But when I arrived, the cabin was gone, the clearing was still there, but there was no sign of the cabin, no broken furniture, no old photographs, nothing. It was as if the cabin had never existed. But I knew what I had seen, knew that it had been real, and when I turned to leave, I found something lying on the ground where the cabin had in the photograph, the same one I had found on my pillow. I left the park shortly after that, transferring to another station in a different state. I couldn't stay there, not after what had happened. But even now, years later, I can still hear the whispers, still feel the eyes watching me from the shadows. I've heard stories from other rangers, tales of strange occurrences in the wilderness, of places that shouldn't exist and things that can't be explained. I don't know if they're true, but I do know one thing. The wilderness is a vast, untamed place, full of mysteries that we may never understand, and sometimes those mysteries find you, no matter how far you run. I had always loved the solitude of the wilderness. Being a park ranger allowed me to immerse myself in nature, away from the chaos of city life. The remote corners of the national parks were my sanctuary, places where I could find peace in the quiet rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. But that all changed one winter, when I was stationed at a remote outpost in the northern Rockies. My name is Lisa, and I had been a park ranger for about 5 years. When I was assigned to the Lone Pine Ranger Station, it was the kind of place where you could go weeks without seeing another human being, especially in the winter, when the snow made the trails nearly impassable. It was early December when I arrived at Lone Pine. The first snow had already fallen, covering the ground in a thick, white blanket. The station was a small, one-room cabin, equipped with just the basics: a wood stove for heat, a radio for communication, and a few supplies to last me through the winter. It was exactly the kind of assignment I had been hoping for, a chance to really connect with nature, to test myself against the elements. The first few weeks were everything I had expected. The days were short, the nights long and cold, but I was content. I spent my time patrolling the trails, checking for signs of wildlife, and making sure the snow didn't block the few roads that led to the station. The radio was my only link to the outside world, and I would check in with the main ranger station once a day, just to let them know I was okay. It was during one of these routine patrols that I first noticed something strange. I was following a trail that wound through a dense section of forest, the trees so close together that they blocked out most of the sunlight. The snow was deep, and I had to move slowly, careful not to lose my footing. As I walked, I noticed tracks in the snow, leading off the trail and into the woods. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, maybe a deer or an elk, but as I got closer, I realized they were human footprints. They were old, the edges blurred and softened by the wind, but still clearly visible. The tracks led deeper into the forest, away from any of the established trails. I hesitated, my instincts telling me to turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow the tracks to see where they led. The forest was silent, the only sound the crunch of snow under my boots and the occasional creak of the trees in the wind. The tracks wound through the trees, twisting and turning in a way that made it hard to keep my bearings. After about an hour of walking, I came to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it, a campsite, long abandoned and half buried in the snow. There was a tent, collapsed and torn, its fabric flapping in the wind. A few pieces of equipment were scattered around a backpack, a cooking pot, a pair of boots. But there was no sign of the person who had made the tracks, no indication of what had happened to them. I knelt down and inspected the campsite more closely. The tent was old, the fabric weathered and brittle. The boots were covered in a layer of frost, stiff and frozen. Everything looked like it had been there for months, if not longer, but the tracks leading to the campsite were fresh, no more than a day or two old. A sense of unease settled over me, and I decided to head back to the station. I radioed in, reporting what I had found, but the main station didn't have any record of a missing hiker in the area. They told me to keep an eye out, to check the surrounding trails, but there wasn't much else they could do. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The tracks had been fresh, but there was no sign of the person who had made them. I went back to the clearing several times, hoping to find some clue, but each time I returned, the campsite looked more and more desolate, as if it had been abandoned for years. Then, one night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside the station. The wind was howling, the snow falling heavily, but I could hear the crunch of boots on the frozen ground. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the door, but when I opened it, there was no one there, just the empty forest, the trees bending under the weight of the snow. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight around the clearing, but there was nothing, no tracks, no sign that anyone had been there. The wind whipped the snow into a frenzy, stinging my face, and I quickly retreated back into the cabin, bolting the door behind me. The next morning, I found tracks in the snow, leading from the forest to the door of the station. They were the same tracks I had seen in the woods, the same size, the same shape, but they stopped at the door, as if the person had just disappeared. I radioed the main station again, telling them about the tracks, about the footsteps in the night. They sent a team to check on me, to make sure I was okay, but by the time they arrived, the tracks had been covered by the snow, and there was no evidence of anyone else being there. The team stayed for a few days, helping me patrol the area, but nothing unusual happened while they were there. No more tracks, no more footsteps in the night. They chalked it up to the isolation, the cold, maybe even the stress of being alone in such a remote place. But I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. After they left, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I started to see things out of the corner of my eye, shadows moving in the trees, figures standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. Then, one night I woke to the sound of someone knocking on the door. It was a slow, deliberate knock, the kind you make when you know someone is home. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my flashlight and went to the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just the sound of the wind howling outside. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand on the doorknob, not sure if I should open it or not. Finally, I mustered the courage to unlock the door and pull it open. The cold air rushed in, and I shined my flashlight out into the night. There was no one there, but the tracks were back, leading from the forest to the door. They were fresh, the edges sharp and clear in the snow. I followed the tracks with my flashlight, but they stopped abruptly just a few feet from the door, as if whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the stove, my flashlight in hand, waiting for something to happen. But the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin as it settled in the cold. The next morning, I radioed the main station and told them I was leaving. I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and hiked out to the nearest road, where a ranger picked me up. I never went back to Lone Pine. To this day, I don't know what happened out there. Maybe it was just the isolation, the cold, playing tricks on my mind. But I can't shake the feeling that something was out there in the woods, something that was watching me, something that didn't want me to leave. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I still hear those footsteps, crunching in the snow, coming closer and closer. Being a park ranger in a remote area was a dream come true. I had always been drawn to the wilderness, to the peace and quiet that came with being miles away from civilization. The Rocky Mountain National Park was my haven, a place where I felt truly alive, surrounded by towering pines and endless trails that wound through the rugged landscape. My name is Ben, and I had been stationed at the Echo Ridge Outpost, one of the most isolated posts in the entire park, for about 3 years. The solitude was something I had grown to appreciate, a time for reflection and connection with nature. But there were moments when that isolation brought more than just peace. It brought a creeping sense of dread. It was the fall of 2019, just before the first snow of the season. The air was crisp, the leaves turning shades of orange and red, blanketing the forest floor in a warm, vibrant carpet. The park was quieter than usual, with most of the summer tourists long gone and only a few late-season hikers and campers remaining. My routine patrols were uneventful, just as I liked them. But then one day, something happened that shook me to my core. I was on a late afternoon patrol, following a trail that looped around Echo Ridge and led to a secluded overlook. It was one of my favorite spots, a place where you could see the entire valley below, with the mountains stretching out into the distance like jagged teeth. The trail itself was well worn, but rarely used this time of year, making it the perfect place for a quiet walk. As I made my way up the trail, I noticed something odd, a sound that didn't belong. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the rustling of the leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. But as I continued, it grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of footsteps, echoing off the trees, matching my own pace exactly. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped too, the forest falling silent. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the trees, but there was no one there, just the shadows, lengthening as the sun dipped lower in the sky. I shook it off, telling myself it was just an echo, a trick of the acoustics in the valley. But as I started walking again, the footsteps resumed, always a few steps behind me, just out of sight. The unease that had been gnawing at the back of my mind began to grow, and I quickened my pace, hoping to put some distance between myself and whatever was making those sounds. When I finally reached the overlook, the footsteps stopped abruptly, as if they had never been there at all. I stood at the edge of the cliff, trying to calm my nerves, breathing in the cool, crisp air. The view was as breathtaking as always, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided to head back before it got too dark. The trail was even quieter on the way down, the silence pressing in on me like a heavy blanket. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But the trail was empty. As I neared the outpost, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the trail, was a single boot print, fresh and clear in the soft earth. But it wasn't my boot print. It was larger, deeper, as if made by someone much heavier than me. I stared at it, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. There was no way anyone else could have been on the trail. I would have seen them, or at least heard them. I bent down to inspect the print more closely, and that's when I noticed something even more disturbing. It was pointing in the wrong direction. The print wasn't leading away from the outpost, but toward it, as if someone had been walking right behind me the entire time. I stood up quickly, my eyes darting around the forest. The shadows were growing longer, the light fading fast. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to get back to the safety of the outpost, to lock the door and not look back. When I reached the outpost, I slammed the door shut behind me, bolting it with trembling hands. I tried to calm myself, to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, that the print had been left by another ranger or a hiker earlier in the day. But deep down I knew that wasn't the case. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind outside set my heart racing. I kept hearing those footsteps in my mind, echoing in the silence, getting closer and closer. The next morning, I decided to investigate the trail again. I had to know if there was someone or something out there. I followed the path up to the overlook, my eyes scanning the ground for any signs of movement. But the trail was empty, the leaves undisturbed. When I reached the overlook, I noticed something that hadn't been there the day before, a small, weathered notebook lying on a rock, half hidden under a pile of leaves. I picked it up, the leather cover cracked and worn with age. It looked like it had been out in the elements for years. Yet somehow it hadn't been there yesterday. I opened the notebook, flipping through the yellowed pages. Most of it was illegible, the ink faded and smudged, but there were a few entries that I could still make out. They were written in a hurried, shaky hand, as if the writer had been in a state of panic. October 5th. Something is following me. Footsteps, always just behind. October 7th. Can't escape. No matter how far I run, it's always there. October 10th. I can hear it breathing now. It's so close. The entries stopped abruptly, the last few pages torn out. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that the dates in the notebook were from years ago, long before I had ever been stationed at Echo Ridge. I pocketed the notebook and headed back to the outpost, my mind racing. Who had left the notebook there, and why had it appeared now, after all these years? That night the footsteps came again, but this time they didn't stop at the door. I could hear them circling the cabin, slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. I stayed up all night, clutching my flashlight, waiting for whatever it was to make its move. But nothing happened. The next day, I contacted the main station, telling them everything. They sent a team to check on me, but by the time they arrived, the footsteps had stopped, and the notebook was gone, The team found no signs of anyone else in the area, no evidence that anything unusual had happened. They suggested I take some time off, get some rest. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, they said. But I knew better. I left Echo Ridge shortly after that, transferred to another park in a different state. But I couldn't leave the memories behind. The footsteps, the notebook, the sense of being watched, it all stayed with me, a constant reminder that some things in the wilderness can't be explained. Even now, years later, I can still hear those footsteps in my dreams, echoing off the trees, getting closer and closer. And every time I wake up with the same feeling that whatever was out there on that trail, it's still following me. There's something about the vastness of nature that humbles you. As a park ranger stationed in one of the most remote parts of the Appalachian Trail, I had learned to appreciate the small things like the way the morning mist clung to the trees or the sound of a stream trickling through the underbrush. But with that beauty came a sense of unease, a reminder that nature, no matter how serene, could be unforgiving. My name is Jackson, and for the last 8 years I had worked at various national parks, but none as isolated as the Black Hollow Ranger Station. It was a small outpost, deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. The station itself was little more than a wooden cabin, equipped with a radio, a wood stove, and enough supplies to last through the harsh winter months. Black Hollow was known for its rugged beauty, but it also had a reputation among the rangers. Stories had circulated for years about strange occurrences, unexplained noises, eerie lights in the woods, and an unsettling feeling that you were never truly alone. I had always dismissed these stories as nothing more than campfire tales, the product of overactive imaginations and too much time spent in the woods. That all changed during the winter of 2020. It was early December when I first noticed something was off. The days were getting shorter, the nights colder, and the forest had taken on an almost oppressive silence. The usual sounds of wildlife, the rustle of leaves, the calls of birds seemed to vanish, leaving only the sound of the wind as it howled through the trees. I was out on a routine patrol, following a trail that looped around the base of Black Hollow Mountain. The trail was steep and rocky, winding its way through dense forest and overgrown brush. It wasn't a popular trail, especially this time of year, and I didn't expect to see anyone out there. As I made my way up the trail, I noticed something strange. The wind had picked up, gusting through the trees with an almost unnatural force. It wasn't unusual for the wind to be strong in these parts, but this was different. It was as if the wind had a voice, whispering through the branches, carrying with it a sound that set chills down my spine. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the product of too many nights spent alone in the woods. But the sound grew louder, more distinct, until I could make out words, faint and barely audible, carried on the wind. Help. Emmy. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the wind, but it was there. I strained to listen, turning in the direction of the sound, but it seemed to come from all around me, echoing through the trees. I called out, my voice swallowed by the wind. There was no response, just the same faint whisper, growing more distant with each passing second. Help. Me. I knew I should have turned back, returned to the safety of the station, but something compelled me to continue to follow the sound. Even though every instinct told me to leave, I pressed on, my feet crunching through the snow. As I made my way deeper into the forest, the trail grew narrower, the trees closing in around me, their branches heavy with snow. The wind had died down, replaced by an eerie stillness, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. The voice had faded, but I could still feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I reached a clearing at the base of the mountain, a place I had visited many times before. The snow was deep here, untouched by any tracks or signs of life, but something was different. The air was heavy, thick with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake, and then I saw it, something buried in the snow just at the edge of the clearing. I approached cautiously, my breath fogging in the cold air. As I got closer, I realized it was a figure, half buried in the snow, motionless. My heart raced as I knelt down, brushing the snow away with trembling hands. It was a man, his skin pale and lifeless, his eyes staring blankly into the sky. He was dressed in hiking gear, his clothes frozen stiff, his face twisted in an expression of terror. But what struck me most was the age of the clothing. It was outdated, decades old, like something out of an old photograph. The fabric was worn, the colors faded, as if he had been there for years, preserved by the cold. I radioed the main station, my voice shaking as I reported what I had found. They told me to stay put, that a team would be dispatched to investigate. But as I stood there, staring at the frozen figure, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. And then the wind picked up again, carrying with it that same faint whisper, "Help." Me? I turned in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there, just the trees swaying in the wind, their branches creaking under the weight of the snow. The voice seemed to be coming from all around me, echoing through the forest, growing more desperate with each passing second. I backed away from the body, my pulse racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The voice was growing louder now, more insistent, as if it was right behind me. I turned and ran, the snow crunching beneath my boots as I fled down the trail. The voice followed me, growing louder and more frantic, the words blending together into a frantic, desperate plea. "Help me, help me, help me." I didn't stop until I reached the station, slamming the door behind me, my hands shaking as I bolted it shut. The wind was howling outside, but the voice was gone, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the crackling of the fire in the stove. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to calm myself, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something beyond my understanding, something that didn't belong in this world. When the team arrived the next morning, they found no trace of the body. The snow had covered any evidence, erasing any sign that someone had been there. They searched the area, but there was nothing, no tracks, no sign of a struggle, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there at all. They told me it was probably just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination brought on by the isolation and the cold. But I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. The following spring, when the snow melted, they found his remains in the same spot where I had seen him. The team that found him said it looked like he had been there for decades, his body perfectly preserved by the cold. There were no signs of foul play, no indication of what had happened to him. But what struck me most was the look on his face, the same expression of terror I had seen in the snow dot. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in those woods. Maybe it was the spirit of the man, trapped in the snow, unable to move on. Or maybe it was something else, something darker that lingers in the depths of Black Hollow. I transferred out of the park soon after that, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me, something that wanted me to return. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the trees, I can still hear that voice, faint and desperate, whispering through the darkness, "Help me." I had always been drawn to the stillness of the forest at night. There was something about the way the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground that both terrified and fascinated me. As a park ranger in one of the most secluded parts of the Pacific Northwest, I had grown accustomed to the solitude, to the quiet hours spent patrolling the trails and ensuring the safety of the park. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered one cold October night, a night that still haunts my dreams. My name is Mark, and I have been a ranger for over a decade. I've seen my fair share of strange things, odd noises in the night, unexplainable lights in the sky, and even the occasional lost hiker who swore they saw something in the woods. But I had always managed to explain these occurrences away, attributing them to wildlife, weather, or the overactive imaginations of those who weren't used to the isolation of the wilderness. That is, until I took up the night shift at Clearwater National Park. Clearwater was a beautiful place, known for its dense forests, pristine lakes, and rugged mountains. It was also remote, miles from the nearest town, and accessible only by a single winding road that cut through the thick woods. During the day, the park was a haven for hikers, campers, and nature enthusiasts. But at night, it transformed into something entirely different, a place of shadows and silence, where the line between reality and nightmare blur. It was during one of those long, quiet nights that I found myself patrolling a trail known as the Blackwood Path. The trail was notorious among the rangers for its unsettling atmosphere. It was a narrow, twisting path that wound through a particularly dense part of the forest, where the trees grew so close together that they seemed to form a tunnel of darkness. Few visitors ventured down Blackwood Path, especially after sunset, and those who did often returned with stories of feeling watched, of hearing strange noises just beyond the reach of their flashlights. I had never put much stock in those stories. I considered them the product of overactive imaginations and the natural fear that comes with being alone in the woods. But as I made my way down the path that night, I began to understand why the trail had such a reputation. The air was crisp and cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes your breath visible in the pale moonlight. The trees loom overhead, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers, blocking out most of the sky. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant hoot of an owl. It was the kind of night that made you acutely aware of how alone you were. I was about halfway down the trail when I first noticed a faint, almost imperceptible movement out of the corner of my eye. I stopped, shining my flashlight into the trees, but saw nothing. Just the same dense forest, the same tangled branches swaying gently in the breeze. I chalked it up to my imagination, a trick of the light, and continued on my way. But then it happened again, a rustle in the bushes, a shadow darting between the trees. This time I was certain I had seen something, though what it was I couldn't say. I called out, my voice echoing through the stillness, "Hello, is someone there?" There was no response, just the whisper of the wind through the leaves. I stood there for a moment, listening, my hand resting on the handle of the radio clipped to my belt. I was ready to dismiss it as a deer or some other nocturnal animal when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't like any animal sound I had ever heard. It was deep, almost inhuman, and it seemed to reverberate through the trees, coming from all directions at once. My heart began to race, and I found myself reaching for the flashlight with my other hand, gripping it so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I scanned the forest, the beam of light cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows, stretching endlessly in every direction. But the growl persisted, growing louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was right behind me. I spun around, shining the light directly into the trees, and that's when I saw it, a pair of eyes, glowing a sickly yellow in the darkness. They were large, too large to belong to any animal I knew of, and they were fixed on me with an intensity that sent a jolt of fear through my entire body. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just stared at me from the shadows. And then, slowly, they began to rise, as if whatever they belonged to was standing up, revealing itself. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, growing closer. With every second, I ran faster than I ever had before, the flashlight swinging wildly in my hand, casting frantic beams of light across the trail. I didn't dare look back, too terrified of what I might see. All I could think about was getting back to the ranger station, to the safety of the warm lights and solid walls. The footsteps were right behind me now, so close I could feel the ground tremble beneath me. Whatever it was big, and it was fast. I could hear its breath, hot and heavy, like a predator closing in on its prey. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, the trail opened up into a clearing, and there, in the distance, I saw the faint glow of the ranger station's lights. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with exhaustion, my lungs screaming for air. I burst through the door of the station, slamming it shut behind me, my hands shaking as I locked it. I stood there for a moment, leaning against the door, trying to catch my breath, my heart pounding in my ears. The station was empty, just as I had left it. The radio crackled softly on the desk, the logs in the fireplace smoldering quietly. I half expected the door to burst open, for whatever was out there to come crashing in, but the night was silent. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, my flashlight clutched in my hand, waiting for those yellow eyes to appear again. But they never did. When morning came, I ventured back out to the trail, my hands still trembling, my mind replaying the events of the night before. I searched the area where I had seen the eyes, where I had heard the growl, but there was nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anything had been there at all. The other rangers arrived later that day, and I told them what had happened. They listened, their expressions a mix of concern and disbelief, but none of them had an explanation. The trail was checked, and the area around the station was searched, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. I was given a few days off to rest, to recover from the ordeal. But no amount of rest could erase what I had seen, what I had heard. Those eyes, that growl, the feeling of being hunted, it all stayed with me, knowing at the edges of my mind. I returned to the park a few days later, determined to put the experience behind me, to get back to my routine. But the night shift was never the same. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. The other rangers started to notice the change in me, the way I jumped at every sound, the way I avoided the blackwood path. I didn't care what they thought. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt, and I knew that whatever it wasn't something that belonged in this world. As the weeks went by, I began to hear stories from other rangers, stories that echoed my own experience. They spoke of strange noises in the night, of shadows that moved on their own, of eyes that watched from the darkness. Some of them laughed it off, but I could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear that haunted my dreams. Eventually, I requested a transfer to another park, one that was far from the deep, dark woods of Clearwater. I needed to get away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was lurking in those trees. But no matter how far I go, I can't escape the memory of that night. The eyes, the growl, The feeling of being hunted is all burned into my mind, a constant reminder that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that exist in the shadows, waiting for us to venture too far into the darkness. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the trees and the shadows grow long, I can still feel them watching me, those yellow eyes, waiting for the moment when I let my guard down, when I forget that they're still out there in the darkness, watching, waiting. The quiet of the night and the deep woods has a way of getting under your skin. I've been a park ranger in the remote stretches of Yellowstone National Park for almost 15 years, and while I've seen some strange things out here, nothing ever prepared me for the night I found myself on the forgotten patrol dot. It was mid-November, and winter had already started to settle in. The days were shorter, and the nights seemed to stretch on forever. Most of the tourists had gone, leaving the park in the hands of a skeleton crew of rangers tasked with keeping the wilderness safe and monitored. With the first heavy snowfall expected any day, we were all on high alert, making sure everything was in place before the deep freeze set in. I had been assigned to the South Ridge Trail. At night, a path known for its steep inclines and dense forest, the trail wasn't used much during the winter, and by this time of year it was mostly deserted. My job was simple: hike up the ridge, check the old fire lookout at the top, and make sure everything was secure before the snow made it inaccessible. The South Ridge Trail was a challenging hike even in the best of conditions, but that night the air was heavy with an oppressive chill, and the forest was unnaturally silent. As I started up the trail, the beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing only the skeletal branches of trees and the occasional patch of ice beneath the fallen leaves. The wind was a low, steady moan, rustling through the branches like a whispered warning. About an hour into my hike, I started to notice something strange. It was a smell, faint at first but unmistakable, the acrid scent of smoke. At first I thought it might be a campfire, but there were no campers this deep in the park, especially not at this time of year. I quickened my pace, concerned that maybe a tree had been struck by lightning and sparked a fire dot. As I climbed higher, the smell grew stronger, and soon I could see a faint orange glow through the trees ahead. My heart raced as I pushed forward, the wind biting at my face as I crested a small rise and saw it a fire burning near the base of an old oak tree just off the trail. But what struck me as odd was the way the fire burned. It wasn't spreading, wasn't crackling or spitting sparks like a normal fire. It was just there, a small, steady flame that seemed almost contained, as if it were being fed by something unseen. I approached cautiously, my flashlight trained on the fire, ready to radio in for backup if needed. As I got closer, the smell of smoke was almost overwhelming, but there was something else mixed in, something metallic, like the scent of burning wires. And then I saw him. He was sitting on the ground just a few feet from the fire, his back against the trunk of the tree. He was dressed in an old ranger uniform, one I hadn't seen in years, the fabric faded and worn, the patches barely visible in the dim light. His face was pale, almost ghostly, his eyes fixed on the flames, and blinking. "Hey," I called out, my voice trembling as I approached. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. I moved closer, my hand resting on the radio clipped to my belt, ready to call for assistance. But as I stepped into the light of the fire, I felt a wave of unease wash over me. There was something wrong with the way he was sitting, something unnatural about the stillness of his body. And then, as I looked closer, I realized what it was. His chest wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. My heart pounded. in my chest as I crouched down beside him, reaching out to check for a pulse. But as my fingers brushed against his cold, lifeless skin, I recoiled in horror. His body was stiff, rigid, as if he had been dead for days. Yet there was no sign of decay, no indication of how long he had been there. I stumbled back, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The fire continued to burn, casting flickering shadows across his face, but there was no warmth from the flames, no heat. It was as if the fire wasn't really there, as if it were just an illusion, a mirage in the cold night air. And then he moved. It was subtle, at first a slight twitch of his fingers, a barely perceptible shift in his posture. But as I watched in stunned silence, his head slowly turned toward me, his eyes locking onto mine. There was no life in those eyes, no spark of consciousness, just a dull, empty gaze that sent a chill down my spine. "Help. Emmy," the words were barely a whisper, rasping from his throat like dry leaves in the wind. I staggered back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The radio crackled to life at my hip, the voice of the dispatcher breaking through the static, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I was frozen, trapped in the gaze of those lifeless eyes, my mind unable to comprehend what I was witnessing. "Help me," the words repeated, louder this time, more insistent, as if he was trying to draw me closer, trying to pull me into whatever nightmare he was trapped in. But I couldn't move, couldn't tear myself away from the horror unfolding before me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. His head slumped forward, his body going limp as the fire flickered and died, leaving me standing in the darkness, the cold night air pressing in around me. I don't remember much of what happened next. Somehow I managed to radio for help, and the other rangers found me wandering near the base of the trail, my mind a fog of confusion and fear. They searched the area, but there was no sign of the man, no sign of the fire. The ground where I had seen him sitting was cold and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. When I described the uniform he was wearing, one of the older rangers went pale. He told me about a ranger who had gone missing on that trail over 30 years ago. He had been out on a routine patrol, just like I was, and never returned. They searched for weeks, but he was never found, his disappearance becoming just another unsolved mystery of the park. I took a leave of absence after that, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me out of those woods, something that still watches me from the shadows. I've tried to move on, tried to forget what I saw that night, but it haunts me, knowing at the edges of my mind. I know now why they call it the Forgotten Patrol. It's a warning, a reminder that the wilderness is not a place to be taken lightly, that there are things out there, hidden in the darkness, that we may never understand. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can still hear his voice, faint and desperate, calling out from the void, "Help me." I had always prided myself on my composure, my ability to remain calm under pressure. As a park ranger stationed in the vast and rugged wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, it was a skill I relied on frequently, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered one fateful night on the Whispering Pines Trail, a night that still chills my blood every time I think about it. The Whispering Pines Trail was one of the more secluded paths in the park, winding through a dense forest of towering pines that seemed to whisper to one another as the wind blew through their branches. The trail wasn't very popular with tourists. Its remote location and the thick canopy overhead kept it shrouded in darkness even on the brightest days. But for seasoned hikers and nature enthusiasts, it offered a sense of isolation that was hard to find anywhere else. It was early December, and the park was covered in a thick blanket of snow. The temperatures had dropped significantly over the past week, and the forecast warned of an incoming blizzard. As a precaution, the park was closing the trails to the public, but it was my job to ensure that no one was still out there before the storm hit. That night I was assigned to sweep the Whispering Pines Trail. I started my hike just as the sun was beginning to set, casting a deep orange glow across the snow-covered landscape. The sky was clear, the air crisp and cold, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots in the snow and the distant call of a lone wolf. Despite the looming storm, the night was peaceful, almost serene. As I made my way deeper into the forest, the trees closed in around me, their branches heavy with snow, creating an eerie tunnel of darkness. The wind picked up, causing the pines to sway and creak, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. I had heard the whispers many times before, but that night they seemed different, more pronounced, almost like voices trying to speak just beyond the edge of my hearing. I shook off the uneasy feeling and continued my patrol, my flashlight cutting through the gloom as I scanned the trail for any signs of hikers. The snow was untouched, undisturbed except for the occasional tracks of small animals. I was confident I was the only one out there. About an hour into my hike, I came across something that made me stop in my tracks, a set of footprints in the snow. They were fresh, leading off the trail and into the dense woods. My first thought was that a hiker had gotten lost or had strayed from the path, but something about the prints bothered me. They were uneven, as if the person had been staggering, and they disappeared into the darkness of the forest, where the trees grew too close together for anyone to walk through easily. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the tracks. I radioed in my location, letting the others know I might be dealing with a lost hiker, and then I stepped off the trail. Moving cautiously through the thick underbrush, the footprints led me deeper into the forest, winding between the trees in a seemingly aimless pattern. The further I went, the stronger the whispers became, until they were a constant murmur in my ears, almost like voices surrounding me on all sides. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, warning, and desperate. I pressed on, determined to find whoever had made the tracks. But as I went further, I began to notice something strange. The footprints seemed to be multiplying. What had started as a single set of tracks now branched off in multiple directions, crisscrossing through the snow as if the person had been running in circles. But that wasn't the worst part. Some of the tracks were human. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I examined the new tracks. They were large, too large to belong to any animal native to the area, and the shape was all wrong. They looked like elongated, twisted versions of human footprints, with toes that were too long and too many of them. A deep sense of dread settled over me as I realized that whatever had made those tracks wasn't human, and it was following the same path as the original footprints. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to get out of there as quickly as possible, but I couldn't leave without knowing what had happened. I had to find the person. To make sure they were safe, I followed the twisted tracks, my heart pounding in my chest, the whispers now a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from all around me. The trees loomed overhead, their branches creaking ominously as the wind picked up, blowing snow into my face and obscuring my vision. Finally, I reached a small clearing where the tracks came to an abrupt stop. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, hunched over and shivering in the cold. The figure was dressed in tattered clothing, their back to me, and they seemed to be muttering to themselves, their breath visible in the frigid air. I approached cautiously, my flashlight trained on the figure. "Are you all right?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The figure didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. They just kept muttering, their words a low, incoherent murmur that blended with the whispers of the trees. I stepped closer, reaching out a hand to touch their shoulder, when suddenly they turned to face me. I recoiled in horror. The face that stared back at me was not human. It was twisted, deformed, with eyes that glowed a sickly yellow in the darkness. The skin was pale and stretched tight over the bones, and the mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin that sent a wave of nausea through me. Before I could react, the figure let out a guttural growl, and I realized with a jolt of terror that the muttering I had heard wasn't coming from them, it was coming from the trees. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as the figure lunged at me, its elongated fingers reaching for my throat. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet as I tried to escape. The figure moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between us in seconds. I swung my flashlight at it, the beam of light cutting through the darkness and momentarily blinding the creature. In that split second, I saw something that nearly made my heart stop. The creature wasn't alone. All around the clearing, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, were more of them, their twisted forms barely visible in the shadows, their yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. They were watching, waiting. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't care about the trail, didn't care about the footprints. I just ran, the creature's guttural growls echoing behind me, their twisted shapes moving through the trees like shadows come to life. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step, until it felt like they were screaming in my ears, urging me to run faster, to escape. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I burst out of the woods and onto the main trail. I didn't stop running until I reached the ranger station, slamming the door behind me and collapsing against it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The other rangers found me there, shaking and barely coherent, my flashlight still clutched in my hand. They searched the Whispering Pines trail, but found nothing, no footprints, no signs of a struggle, nothing to suggest that anyone had been out there. The clearing I described didn't exist, and the twisted tracks I had seen were gone, as if they had never been there at all. I took some time off after that, trying to make sense of what had happened, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had come face to face with something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. The whispers still haunt me, echoing in my mind whenever I'm alone in the dark, reminding me of that night in the Whispering Pines. I eventually returned to the park, but I avoid the Whispering Pines trail now, and I'm not the only one. The other rangers have heard the stories, have felt the strange presence that lingers in those woods. We don't talk about it much, but we all know it's there waiting, watching. And every now and then, on cold winter nights, when the wind blows through the trees and the snow begins to fall, I swear I can hear them, the whispers, faint and distant, calling me back to the darkness. In the northeastern part of the park, nestled deep within the heart of the wilderness, sits North Lake Lookout, an old fire tower that has stood sentinel over the forest for nearly a century. It was one of the first places I was assigned to when I became a park ranger, and although the tower was no longer in active use, it served as a checkpoint for those of us patrolling the more remote areas of the park. The tower had a reputation among the rangers. It was said to be haunted, that the stories were vague, just campfire tales, passed down from one generation of rangers to the next. I never gave them much thought. After all, I was there to do a job, not to chase ghosts. But one winter night, I found out just how real those stories were. It was late January, and a fierce storm had blown in from the north, covering the park in a thick layer of snow. The air was brutally cold, and the wind howled through the trees like a pack of wolves. I was on solo patrol at night, making my way up to North Lake Lookout to check on the structure and make sure it was holding up against the storm. The hike up to the lookout was treacherous in the best of conditions, but that night was particularly bad. The snow was deep, and the wind was so strong it nearly knocked me off my feet more than once. The path was barely visible, and I had to rely on my GPS and the faint light of my headlamp to guide me. After what felt like hours of trudging through the snow, I finally reached the base of the tower. The wind whipped around the metal structure, making it groan and creak like an old ship at sea. I was relieved to see that the tower was still standing, but something about the place felt different that night. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and the forest around me was eerily silent. Save for the wind, I climbed the stairs to the lookout platform, each step echoing through the empty tower. As I ascended, the wind seemed to grow louder, and the temperature dropped even further. By the time I reached the top, my breath was coming out in clouds of white mist, and my fingers were numb inside my gloves. The lookout itself was a small, enclosed room with windows on all sides, offering a panoramic view of the surrounding forest. But that night, all I could see was a swirling mass of snow, the visibility reduced to almost nothing. I stepped inside, grateful for the shelter, and began my inspection. The room was just as I remembered it, sparse and utilitarian, with an old wooden desk, a chair, and a few shelves lined with outdated maps and equipment. The walls were covered in graffiti, the remnants of past rangers who had spent long, lonely nights up here, marking the passage of time with their names and dates carved into the wood dot. As I moved about the room, checking the windows and making sure everything was secure, I began to feel a strange sensation, as if I were being watched. It was an unsettling feeling, one that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the entire structure shudder, but inside it was deathly quiet. And then I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the far corner of the room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen. The tapping was rhythmic, deliberate, like the sound of someone knocking on wood dot. I slowly turned my head toward the source of the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, in the corner of the room, was the old wooden desk, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. But it wasn't the desk that held my attention, it was the chair in front of it. The chair was rocking back and forth, the legs tapping against the wooden floor in that same rhythmic pattern. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the chair, unable to move, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. There was no one there, nothing that could have caused the chair to move on its own, yet it continued to rock, the tapping growing louder, more insistent. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the chair stopped. The room fell silent once more, the only sound the wind outside and the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I wanted to leave, to get out of that tower as fast as I could, but something kept me rooted to the spot, a morbid curiosity that refused to let me turn away. That's when I noticed the cold dot. It wasn't just the chill of the winter air, it was something more, something unnatural. The temperature in the room had plummeted, and I could see my breath hanging in the air like smoke. My fingers were numb, and a deep, one chilling cold seeped into my body, making it hard to move. And then I saw it dot in the reflection of the window. Just behind me was a figure, a shadowy silhouette, standing in the middle of the room. My blood ran cold as I realized I wasn't alone. The figure was tall and indistinct, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its presence, a heavy, oppressive weight that seemed to fill the room. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the empty space where the figure had been, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, just as it had been when I arrived, but the sense of being watched was stronger now, more intense, and I could feel the figure's eyes on me, even though I couldn't see it. Panic set in, and I knew I had to leave. I backed toward the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. But before I could open it, the figure reappeared, this time standing directly in front of me. It was closer now, so close I could almost make out its features, dark, hollow eyes staring back at me from a face that was little more than a shadow. "Get out," a voice whispered, so faint I could barely hear it over the wind. But the words were clear, unmistakable. I didn't need to be told twice. I threw open the door and bolted down the stairs, nearly slipping on the icy steps in my haste to escape. The wind howled around me, the storm raging with renewed fury, but I didn't stop. I ran through the snow, the tower's eerie presence fading into the distance behind me. When I finally reached the ranger station, I was shaking, my clothes soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperatures. The other rangers could see the fear in my eyes, and I quickly told them what had happened. The older rangers exchanged knowing looks, and one of them, a grizzled veteran named Hank, placed a hand on my shoulder. "You met the ghost of North Lake Lookout," he said quietly, his voice grave. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." According to Hank, the ghost was the spirit of a ranger who had died in the tower many years ago during a similar winter storm. He had been trapped up there when the storm hit, and by the time they found him, it was too late. Some say he froze to death, others claim he went mad from the isolation. But whatever the cause, his spirit never left the tower, and he was doomed to haunt it for eternity. I never went back to North Lake Lookout after that night, and the other rangers didn't blame me. The tower still stands, a silent sentinel over the forest, but no one patrols that area alone anymore. The ghost is still there, waiting in the darkness, watching, and every time a storm blows in from the north, the rangers know to stay far, far away. The ghost of North Lake Lookout isn't just a story. It's a warning, a reminder that there are things in this world that we may never fully understand, things that exist beyond the realm of the living. And sometimes, when the wind howls and the snow falls heavy, those things come out to remind us of their presence. I had always considered myself a skeptic. As a park ranger stationed in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, I had heard my fair share of strange stories, tales of ghostly apparitions, mysterious creatures, and unexplained phenomena. But I had always dismissed them as just that, stories. After all, there was a logical explanation for everything, right? That belief was put to the test one cold autumn evening, during what was supposed to be a routine patrol of the Silver Pines area, a remote section of the park known for its dense forests and winding trails. The area was beautiful, but isolated, with only a few visitors venturing that far into the wilderness. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves a riot of red and gold, and the setting sun cast long shadows through the trees. I was paired with another ranger, a seasoned veteran named Greg, who had been working in the park for over a decade. Greg was the kind of guy who had seen it all: bear attacks, lost hikers, you name it. He was calm under pressure and had a dry sense of humor that I had come to appreciate during our shifts together. That evening, we were tasked with checking on the old Silver Pines outpost, a small cabin that had once served as a shelter for rangers and hikers alike, but had fallen into disuse over the years. The outpost was located deep within the forest, accessible only by a narrow, winding trail that cut through some of the most rugged terrain in the park. But as we hiked, the forest around us grew darker, the trees towering overhead like ancient sentinels. The trail was uneven, the ground littered with fallen leaves and branches, and the only sounds were the crunch of our boots and the occasional call of a distant bird. We reached the outpost just as the last light of day was fading. The sky had deep shade of indigo. The cabin was small and weathered, with moss-covered logs and a sagging roof. It looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. Greg pulled out the key and unlocked the door, the old hinges creaking in protest. We stepped inside, the smell of damp wood and decay hitting us immediately. The cabin was as we expected, dusty and abandoned, with only a few pieces of broken furniture and an old wood-burning stove left behind. We split up to inspect the cabin, Greg checking the stove, and me looking over the windows and walls. It was standard procedure, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I moved through the cabin, I began to feel an odd sensation, like a prickling at the back of my neck. It was as if the air had suddenly grown heavier, charged with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Hey, you feel that?" I asked Greg, trying to shake off the unease. Greg looked up from the stove, his expression serious. "Yeah, I feel it," he said quietly. We didn't say anything more, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. It was as if the very air around us had become thick with an unseen presence, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We decided to wrap up our inspection quickly and head back to the main trail before it got too dark. As we stepped outside, the forest was silent, unnervingly so. The usual sounds of the woods at dusk, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, were absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. We started down the trail, our pace quicker than before, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger with each step. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following us, but the path behind us was empty. About halfway down the trail, Greg suddenly stopped in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. "Hear what?" "Listen," Greg whispered, holding up a hand, and then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the distant echo of voices carry on the wind. It was coming from somewhere deep in the forest, to our left, just beyond the trees. "Voices," I said, my heart beginning to race. "Do you think it's hikers?" Greg shook his head, his face pale in the dim light. "There shouldn't be anyone else out here. The trail's been closed for days." We stood there for a moment, listening as the voices grew louder, clearer. It was like a chorus of whispers, unintelligible but filled with an eerie, almost mournful tone. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, and I could see that Greg was just as unsettled. "We should get back to the station," Greg said finally, his voice tense. Now, I didn't argue. We turned and began to move quickly down the trail, our footsteps crunching loudly in the otherwise silent forest. But as we walked, the voices seemed to follow us, growing louder and more distinct. It was as if they were all around us, surrounding us, yet we couldn't see anyone. The faster we walked, closer the voices seemed to come, until it felt like they were right next to us, whispering in our ears. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could see the fear in Greg's eyes. This was no ordinary patrol. Something was very wrong. And then, without warning, the voices stopped. The forest fell silent once more, the oppressive stillness returning, but the sense of unease didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, the silence more unsettling than the whispers had been. We continued down the trail, both of us on edge, our senses heightened. But nothing else happened, no more voices, no more strange sensations. It was as if whatever had been following us had suddenly lost interest. By the time we reached the ranger station, the sun had completely set, and the forest was cloaked in darkness. We didn't speak as we entered the station, both of us shaken by what we had experienced. Later that night, after we had finished our shift, I sat down with Greg to talk about what had happened. He was as puzzled as I was. We both knew the park like the back of our hands, and we both knew that there was no logical explanation for what we had encountered. The trail had been closed, and no one else should have been out there. And yet, those voices had been reel to ignore. Over the next few days, we asked around, speaking to other rangers who had patrolled the Silver Pines area in the past. Some of them had heard the stories, tales of strange occurrences, and unexplained phenomena in that part of the park. But no one had experienced anything quite like what we had. It wasn't until I did some digging into the history of the park that I found a possible explanation. Decades ago, before the area was officially designated as a national park, there had been a small settlement near Silver Pines, a logging community that had been wiped out by a massive forest fire. According to the records, dozens of people had perished in the blaze. Their bodies never recovered. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Could the voices we had heard that night have been the spirits of those lost in the fire, still wandering the forest, trapped between this world and the next? I didn't know for sure, and, to be honest, I didn't want to know. All I knew was that something was out there, something that defied explanation, and it had made its presence known to us in no uncertain terms. Greg and I never patrolled the Silver Pines area alone after that. We made sure to always go in pairs, and we kept our radios close, ready to call for backup if anything strange happened again. But the voices never returned. It was as if they had said their piece, made their point, and then disappeared back into the shadows of the forest. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching, waiting. And every time I passed by the entrance to the Silver Pines Trail, I felt that same prickling at the back of my neck, a reminder of that cold autumn evening, when the forest itself seemed to come alive with the whispers of the past. The vanishing patrol, as we came to call it, became one of those stories we told around the campfire, a tale to scare the new rangers and keep the old ones on their toes. But for Greg and me, it was more than just a story. It was a reminder that some things in this world can't be explained, and that sometimes the forest holds secrets that are best left undisturbed. It was a moonless night in the heart of October when I found myself at Hollow Creek, one of the most isolated areas in the entire park. The area was notorious among the rangers, not just for its treacherous terrain, but for the strange lights that had been reported there for decades. The old-timers called them the witches' lanterns, and while most of us dismissed the tales as folklore, the sheer number of reports made me curious enough to take on the late-night patrol. The drive to Hollow Creek took longer than usual. The dirt road leading into the area was rough, winding through dense woods that seemed to close in around my truck as I drove. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating only a few feet ahead, while the trees cast long, skeletal shadows that danced with the movement of the vehicle. By the time I arrived at the small ranger station near Hollow Creek, it was already well past midnight. The station was little more than a cabin, a relic from when rangers had to stay overnight in remote parts of the park. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the old structure groan in protest. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cold night. The air was crisp with the faint smell of pine and damp earth. The forest around me was eerily quiet, save for the rustle of leaves in the wind. I took a deep breath and began my patrol, heading toward the trail that would lead me to Hollow Creek. The trail was narrow, winding through the thick underbrush and gnarled trees that seemed to loom over me as I walked. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing only the path ahead and the occasional glint of eyes from nocturnal animals watching from the shadows. About halfway to the creek, I began to notice something strange. The air grew heavier, almost oppressive, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it did little to ward off the chill that had settled deep in my bones. And then I saw it, the first of the lights. At first, I thought it was a trick of the eye, a reflection off the leaves, or a firefly. But as I got closer, I realized this was something different. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. Both beautiful and unsettling, I approached cautiously, keeping my flashlight trained on the light. But as I got closer, it vanished. The forest plunged back into darkness, and I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. Unsure of what I had just witnessed, I continued down the trail, my senses on high alert. The reports of the witches' lanterns had always been vague. People claimed to see strange lights that appeared and disappeared without warning, leading them off the trail or into dangerous areas. Some even said the lights were malevolent, intent on luring people to their doom. I had always thought those stories were just that, stories. But now I wasn't so sure. As I neared Hollow Creek, the lights began to reappear, one by one, flickering in and out of existence like spectral flames. They floated just above the ground, moving in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if they were trying to lead me somewhere. Despite the growing unease in my gut, I felt compelled to follow them, driven by a mix of curiosity and something else, something I couldn't quite explain. The creek itself was little more than a narrow stream, surrounded by thick brush and trees that leaned over the water like sentinels. The lights seemed to gather here, dancing along the surface of the water and among the trees, casting eerie reflections that rippled in the dark water. I stood at the edge of the creek, watching the lights with a mixture of awe and dread. They were mesmerizing, their soft glow illuminating the area in a way that felt otherworldly. But there was something wrong about them, something that sent a shiver down my spine. Suddenly, the lights began to move, drifting away from the creek and deeper into the woods. I hesitated for a moment, the rational part of my mind telling me to turn back, but the pull of the lights was too strong. I found myself following them, stepping off the trail and into the dense undergrowth. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out what little light there was from the stars. The ground became uneven, covered in roots and rocks that threatened to trip me with every step. The lights led me deeper into the woods, their glow growing fainter as the trees became more twisted and gnarled. I began to feel disoriented, the landscape around me unfamiliar and strange. It was as if the forest itself was shifting, changing with each step I took. And then, without warning, the lights disappeared. I was plunged into complete darkness, the sudden absence of light leaving me momentarily blinded. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the trees, but there was nothing, no sign of the lights, no indication of where I had come from. The path was gone, swallowed by the forest, and I was alone in the dark, with only the sound of my own breathing for company. Panic began to set in as I realized how far I had wandered from the trail. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same: endless trees and tangled underbrush. The cold had intensified, and I could see my breath in the air, each exhale coming faster as fear gripped me. And then I heard it, a low, humming sound, like a distant chant or a droning voice, rising from somewhere deep within the forest. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second, reverberating through the trees and the ground beneath my feet. I turned in the direction of the sound my flashlight beam shaking in my trembling hand. The sound was coming from somewhere close by, but I couldn't pinpoint its source. It was all around me, echoing through the trees, filling the air with a sense of dread. And then I saw the lights again, but this time they were different. They were no longer the soft, bluish glow I had seen before. They had turned a sickly green, their light harsh and unnatural, casting eerie shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. The lights were no longer hovering, they were moving toward me, converging from all sides, their pace slow but deliberate. I could feel the air grow colder, the chill seeping into my bones, making it hard to breathe. The hum grew louder, more insistent, a droning chorus that filled my head with a sense of impending doom. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering as the batteries began to die. The lights were closing in, their glow growing brighter, more intense. I could see them clearly now, swirling like a vortex, pulling me toward them. The hum was deafening, a relentless noise that drowned out my thoughts, my sense of direction, everything. I knew I had to get out of there, but my body wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear, the lights drawing closer with each passing second. And then, just as the lights were about to engulf me, the hum stopped. The silence was so sudden, so absolute, that it took me a moment to realize what had happened. The lights were gone, and the forest was still, as if nothing had ever happened. I was standing alone in the dark, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't wait to question it. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, my flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away from that place, away from those lights. By some miracle, I found the trail again, and I followed it back to the ranger station as fast as I could, not stopping until I was inside. The door slammed shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely turn the key to lock the door. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the station, staring out the window, half expecting to see those lights again, waiting for them to appear in the darkness. But they never came. The next morning, I reported what had happened to my supervisor, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He nodded along as I spoke, but there was a look in his eyes that said he thought I was just another ranger who had let the isolation get to him. But I knew what I had seen. Those lights, those witches' lanterns, were real, and whatever they weren't just harmless illusions or tricks of the light. They were something else, something malevolent, that lived in the darkest parts of the forest. I never returned to Hollow Creek after that night. I requested a transfer to a different part of the park, and I made sure to stay as far away from that place as possible. But the memory of those lights, the hum in the darkness, stayed with me. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, waiting for the next ranger, the next hiker, the next lost soul to wander into their trap. And if you ever find yourself in Hollow Creek on a dark, moonless night, and you see those lights, do yourself a favor, turn back, because some paths are better left unexplored, and some lights are better left unseen. Blackwood Forest was a place most people avoided, especially at night. As a park ranger, I knew every corner of the park, but something about Blackwood was different. The trees there grew taller and thicker than anywhere else, their branches intertwining like a tangled web, blotting out the sky even during the day. The undergrowth was dense and wild, making it difficult to navigate, and the deeper you went, the more the forest seemed to close in around you. The locals told stories about Blackwood, tales of people who had gone missing, strange lights in the trees, and whispers that carry on the wind. I had always dismissed these stories as just that, stories. But there was one thing that none of us could ignore. The screams. They started about a year ago. Every so often, someone would report hearing screams coming from deep within the forest, usually late at night. The sound was described as a mix between a human cry and an animal's wail, echoing through the trees and sending shivers down the spine of anyone who heard it. As rangers, it was our job to investigate these reports. But every time we ventured into Blackwood, we found nothing, no signs of struggle, no tracks, no evidence that anyone had even been there. The screams would stop as soon as we arrived, and the forest would fall into an eerie silence, as if holding its breath. I had been on several of these patrols, but like everyone else, I had never found anything. That is, until one night in late November. The call came in just after midnight. A hiker, camped out on the edge of Blackwood, had heard the screams again. He was shaken, his voice trembling as he described the sound, saying it was the most terrifying thing he had ever heard. I could hear the fear in his voice, and it sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed my gear and headed out, meeting up with another ranger, Marcus, at the trailhead. Marcus was a veteran ranger, tough and no nonsense. But even he looked uneasy as we prepared to enter Blackwood. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered as we checked our flashlights and radios. "I've been here for over 20 years, and I've never heard anything like those screams." We set off into the forest, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was cold, the wind rustling the leaves above us. The forest was silent except for the crunch of our boots on the undergrowth and the occasional snap of a twig. We followed the main trail for a while, but as we got deeper into the woods, Marcus stopped. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Holding up a hand, I stopped and listened, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of the wind in the trees. But then, faint and distant, I heard it, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from all around us. Marcus and I exchanged a glance. Without a word, we left the trail, moving toward the sound. The further we went, the louder the screams became, until they were echoing through the trees, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. The forest grew denser as we moved deeper into Blackwood. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and rocks that made every step treacherous. I kept my flashlight trained on the path ahead, but the beam seemed to be swallowed up by the darkness. After what felt like hours of walking, we came to a small clearing. The screams had stopped, leaving us in a heavy silence that pressed down on my ears. In the center of the clearing was an old, abandoned cabin, its roof sagging and its walls covered in moss and vines. The door hung off its hinges, creaking softly in the wind. I felt a sense of dread wash over me as I looked at the cabin. It was the last place I wanted to go, but something compelled me to move forward, my feet carrying me toward the door without my conscious decision. Marcus followed close behind, his flashlight beam sweeping over the cabin. "I don't like this," he muttered, his voice tight with unease. "This place wasn't on any of the maps." I reached the door and pushed it open, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, the air thick with the smell of rot and decay. My flashlight illuminated a small room, empty except for a broken chair and a pile of debris in the corner. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. There was something about the cabin that felt wrong, like the walls were closing in on me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Marcus entered behind me, his flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. "What the hell happened here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I was too focused on the pile of debris in the corner. There was something sticking out of it, a piece of cloth, dirty and torn. I walked over and knelt down, reaching out to pull it free. The moment my fingers touched the cloth, the screams started again, louder and more intense than before. They were deafening, filling the cabin with a sound that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The light flickered, casting the room in and out of darkness. Marcus was yelling something, but I couldn't hear him over the screams. I could feel the sound tearing through my mind, scrambling my thoughts, making it impossible to think. I grabbed my flashlight and ran, bursting out of the cabin and into the clearing. The screams followed me, echoing through the trees, growing louder and more distorted. I didn't look back, I just ran, my heart pounding, my breath ragged. Marcus was right behind me, his face pale with fear. We crashed through the underbrush, not caring where we were going, just trying to get as far away from that cabin as possible. Finally, we broke through the trees and onto the main trail. The screams stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving us in a silence that was almost more terrifying. I doubled over, gasping for breath, my legs shaking. What the hell was that? Marcus panted, his eyes wide with fear. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we needed to get out of there, and fast. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the ranger station, the memory of those screams still ringing in our ears. The next morning, we reported what had happened, but no one believed us. The cabin didn't exist on any map, and when we went back to the clearing in the daylight, it was gone. There was no sign of it, no sign that it had ever been there, but Marcus and I knew what we had heard, what we had seen. The screams of Blackwood Forest were real, and they were something that couldn't be explained. To this day, I don't know what caused them, and I'm not sure I want to know. All I know is that I'll never go back to Blackwood Forest, not as long as I live, because some things in this world are better left alone, and some places are better left forgotten. Blackwood Forest is one of those places, and the screams that haunt its depths are a warning one that I'll never forget. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over Silent Valley as I made my way to the ranger outpost. The valley was aptly named, its stillness almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. I'd been assigned to patrol this area for a week, something I wasn't exactly thrilled about. Silent Valley had a reputation for making rangers feel uneasy, for strange occurrences, for things that couldn't quite be explained. The outpost itself was a small, weathered cabin perched on the edge of the valley, overlooking the vast expanse of forest below. It was an isolated spot, cut off from the main trails, and as I arrived, I couldn't help but feel a slight chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The previous ranger had left me a brief note, warning me to be cautious and to avoid the deeper parts of the valley after dark. The note ended with a vague mention of the Watchers. I dismissed it as a joke or an attempt to spook me. After all, park rangers were known to play pranks on each other, especially when it came to new recruits. But as night fell and the full moon rose, I found myself thinking about those words more than I cared to admit. My first night passed uneventfully, though the silence of the valley weighed heavily on my mind. It was so quiet that I could hear every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of the wind through the trees. Sleep was elusive, and I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something, though I didn't know what. The next day, I decided to take a closer look at the valley. I set out early, following the narrow trails that wound through the forest. The trees here were tall and ancient, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy overhead. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the ground was soft underfoot, covered in a layer of moss and fallen leaves. As I ventured deeper into the valley, I began to notice strange things. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their trunks twisted and gnarled as if they were writhing in pain. The undergrowth was dense, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead, and then there was the feeling, an overwhelming sense of being watched. I stopped, turning slowly in a circle, scanning the forest around me. There was no sign of movement, no sound other than the wind in the trees, but the feeling persisted. It was as if 1,000 unseen eyes were trained on me, watching my every move. I shook off the sensation and continued on. But the further I went, the stronger it became. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the light dimmed, casting the forest in an eerie twilight despite the early hour. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps. After an hour of walking, I came to a small clearing, the first I'd seen in the valley. In the center of the clearing was a large, flat rock, covered in strange carvings that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. I knelt down to get a closer look, running my fingers over the symbols etched into the stone. They were unfamiliar, unlike anything I had ever seen before, ancient and mysterious, their meaning lost to time. As I examined the carvings, a sudden gust of wind blew through the clearing, chilling me to the bone. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I stood up quickly, scanning the trees around me. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and twisting as if alive. The wind picked up, carrying with it a low, almost imperceptible whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. It was then that I saw them, the watchers. They were barely visible, blending in with the trees, their forms indistinct and shadowy. At first I thought they were just more trees, but as I stared I realized they were moving, slowly and deliberately. There were dozens of them, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, watching me in silence. I took a step back, my heart racing. The watchers didn't move, but I could feel their gaze on me, cold and unblinking. They were waiting, but for what I didn't know. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on me. Panic began to set in, and I turned to leave the clearing. But the moment I did, the wind died down, and the whispers grew louder. The watchers were drawing closer, their forms becoming more distinct. They were tall and slender, their bodies twisted and contorted, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I bolted, running as fast as I could back through the forest, the watchers closing in around me. The trees seemed to reach out, their branches clawing at my clothes, trying to pull me back. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with words I couldn't understand. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the forest and into the open ground near the outpost. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the watchers were gone. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the valley, and the air was growing cold. I looked back at the forest, half expecting to see the watchers standing at the edge. But there was nothing, just the trees, tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I staggered back to the outpost, my mind reeling from what I had just experienced. I didn't know what the watchers were or what they wanted, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going back into that forest. Not at night, not ever. I spent the rest of the night in the cabin, the door locked and the curtains drawn. The silence of the valley was even more oppressive now, every creak of the cabin making me jump. I kept the lights on, my flashlight within reach, but the sense of unease never left me. The next morning, I reported what had happened to my supervisor, but as expected, he was skeptical. He listened patiently as I described the watchers, the whispers, the carvings on the stone, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He chalked it up to fatigue, to the isolation getting to me, and suggested I take a few days off. I didn't argue. I left Silent Valley that afternoon, and I've never been back. To this day, I don't know what the watchers were or what their purpose was. Were they guardians of the valley, protecting something ancient and powerful? Or were they something darker, something that shouldn't be disturbed? I may never know, but one thing is certain: Silent Valley is not a place for the living. The watchers are still out there, waiting in the shadows, their eyes fixed on the next soul who dares to venture deep into their domain. And if you ever find yourself in that valley, alone and afraid, just remember some things are better left unseen, and some places are better left untouched. The Deep Woods was a place shrouded in mystery and fear, a part of the national park that few dared to enter, especially at night. As a park ranger, with 10 years of experience, I had heard the stories, the tales of missing hikers, strange lights, and eerie sounds that echoed through the trees. But, like most of my colleagues, I dismissed them as nothing more than campfire tales. That was until I was assigned to patrol the Deep Woods one autumn night, an assignment that would change everything. I thought I knew. It was mid-October, and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, blanketing the forest floor in a patchwork of color. The sun was setting as I arrived at the ranger station, casting long shadows over the woods. My assignment was straightforward, a routine patrol of the Deep Woods, checking the trails and making sure no one was camping illegally. Simple enough, or so I thought. I started my patrol just as the last light of day faded, the forest quickly falling into darkness. The Deep Woods was different from the rest of the park, denser, more isolated. The trees here were ancient, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The path was narrow and winding, barely visible under the thick layer of fallen leaves. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close around me, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was a sensation that crept up on me slowly, a tingling at the back of my neck that I tried to ignore, but it persisted, growing stronger the deeper I went into the woods. I stopped several times, shining my flashlight into the trees, but I saw nothing, just the impenetrable darkness between the trunks. I was about an hour into my patrol when I first heard it, a low, distant whisper, carried on the wind. At first I thought it was just the sound of the breeze rustling the leaves, but the more I listened, the more distinct it became. It was a voice, faint and almost indistinguishable, but definitely a voice. I stopped and listened, holding my breath. The whisper came again, clearer this time, but still too faint to make out any words. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the woods, off the main trail. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow it, curiosity getting the better of me. The whispering grew louder as I left the trail, pushing through the undergrowth. The trees here were even thicker, their trunks twisted and gnarled as if they had been shaped by some unseen force. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and rocks that made every step treacherous, but the whispering continued, drawing me further into the darkness. After what felt like an eternity of walking, I came to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old, weathered stone obelisk, covered in moss and half buried in the earth. It was ancient, its surface etched with symbols that I didn't recognize. The whispering was coming from the obelisk, faint and rhythmic, like a chant. I approached the obelisk cautiously, my flashlight beam wavering as I tried to steady my hand. The closer I got, the louder the whispering became. until it filled my ears, drowning out all other sound. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic, and before I knew it, I was standing right in front of the stone, my fingers tracing the strange symbols carved into its surface. As soon as I touched the stone, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I pulled my hand back, my heart pounding in my chest, but it was too late. The air around me had grown thick and heavy, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. Suddenly, the forest came alive with movement. The shadows between the trees shifted, and I caught glimpses of figures moving just out of sight, tall, thin shapes that seemed to glide through the darkness. They were all around me, circling the clearing, their movements swift and silent. Panic set in, and I turned to run. But the moment I did, the whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. The figures in the shadows moved closer, their forms becoming more distinct. They were humanoid, but their limbs were unnaturally long and thin, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I didn't know what these things were, but I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and sprinted back the way I had come, crashing through the undergrowth, the whispering following me, growing louder and louder, until it was a deafening roar. The forest seemed to close in around me as I ran, the trees twisting and contorting as if trying to trap me. I could hear the figures moving through the woods, their footsteps soft but fast, keeping pace with me. The whispering filled my mind, drowning out all rational thought, leaving only fear and the desperate need to escape. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I broke through the trees and onto the main trail. The whispering stopped abruptly, and when I looked back, the figures were gone, the forest once again silent and still. I didn't stop running until I reached the ranger station. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The other rangers looked at me with concern, but I couldn't bring myself to explain what had happened. How could I describe the terror of those whispers, the impossible figures that had chased me through the woods? I never went back to the deep woods after that night. I requested a transfer to a different part of the park, and fortunately, my request was granted. But even now, years later, I can still hear those whispers in my dreams, can still feel the cold, oppressive air of that ancient clearing. There are places in this world that defy explanation, places where the natural and the supernatural intersect. The deep woods is one of those places, a place where the past and present converge, where ancient forces still hold sway. And whatever those forces are, they are best left undisturbed. So if you ever find yourself in the deep woods, and you hear a whisper on the wind, do yourself a favor, turn back. Don't follow it. Some things are better left unheard, and some paths are better left untraveled. The last time I stepped foot in Pine Ridge was nearly 5 years ago, a decision I had come to regret almost immediately after I left. Pine Ridge was a section of the national park that most of the rangers avoided, and not just because of its remoteness. The place had a reputation, stories about strange happenings, unexplained disappearances, and a pervasive sense of unease that seemed to settle over anyone who spent too much time there. As a rookie park ranger, I dismissed these stories as local folklore, the kind of tales told around campfires to scare newcomers. But what I encountered during my time in Pine Ridge was far more terrifying than any ghost story. I was assigned to Pine Ridge for a routine 2-week stint, patrolling the trails, checking on wildlife, and making sure there were no illegal campsites or poachers. It was late November, and the first signs of winter had begun to creep into the forest. The days were short, the air was cold, and the trees, mostly pines, stood tall and silent, their needles carpeting the forest floor. The isolation didn't bother me at first. I was used to being alone in the wilderness, and Pine Ridge, with its towering trees and mist-shrouded paths, had a rugged beauty that I appreciated. But as the days went by, the stillness of the place began to wear on me. The forest was too quiet, too still, as if the usual sounds of wildlife had been swallowed up by the trees. By the third day, I started to notice something strange. It was subtle at first, just a fleeting shadow out of the corner of my eye, or the sensation of being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia, the result of spending too much time alone in an eerie place. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, as I was making my way back to the ranger station, I saw it for the first time. The path I was on wound through a particularly dense section of the forest, where the trees grew so close together that the sky was barely visible. The light was fading quickly, and the shadows were long and dark, stretching across the trail like fingers. As I rounded a bend, I caught sight of a figure standing just off the path, partially obscured by the trees. At first I thought it was another ranger, or maybe a hiker who had wandered off the trail. But as I drew closer, I realized that something was wrong. The figure was tall and thin, almost impossibly so, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were what froze me in my tracks. They were pitch black, void of any light or color, like twin abysses staring back at me. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as the figure stared back at me. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. Then, without warning, the figure turned and glided silently into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. I ran the rest of the way back to the station, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself that it had just been a trick of the light, a shadow, or an animal that I had mistaken for a person. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. Whatever I had seen, it wasn't human. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind outside, set my nerves on edge. I kept the lights on, my eyes fixed on the windows, half expecting to see that figure staring back at me from the darkness. But the night passed without incident, and by morning I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. I decided to stay closer to the station that day, sticking to the more well-traveled trails. But the sense of unease lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The figure didn't appear again, but I could feel his presence, lurking just out of sight, hidden in the shadows of the trees. On the fifth day, I ventured out to check on a remote section of the park that I had been avoiding. The area was known as Dead Man's Hollow, a name that did little to dispel the ominous feeling that had settled over me. The path leading to the hollow was overgrown and difficult to navigate, the trees thick and twisted, their branches forming a tangled canopy overhead. As I made my way deeper into the hollow, the air grew colder, and the light dim, as if the sun itself was being swallowed by the forest. The trees here were ancient, their bark blackened and scarred, and the ground was littered with fallen branches and decaying leaves. It was then that I saw it again, the figure standing at the edge of the hollow, partially obscured by the trees. This time there was no mistaking it. It was the same figure I had seen before, tall and thin, its pale skin almost glowing in the dim light. And those eyes, those empty black eyes, were fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the radio on my belt. But as I reached for it, the figure moved, gliding forward with a speed and grace that was unnerving. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but the figure didn't follow. Instead, it stopped at the center of the hollow, its head tilted as if listening. For a moment, I thought it might speak, but then it turned and pointed to something on the ground. I followed its gaze and saw what it was pointing to: a small, shallow grave, half covered by leaves and dirt. My stomach churned as I realized what I was looking at. The figure remained still, its hand outstretched toward the grave, as if beckoning me to come closer. But every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from that place as possible. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that hollow. The trees seemed to close in around me, the branches clawing at my clothes, trying to pull me back. I could hear the figure behind me, its footsteps soft but deliberate, keeping pace with me. When I finally burst out of the trees and onto the main trail, I didn't stop running until I reached the ranger station. I slammed the door behind me, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the lock. I didn't sleep at all that night, too afraid to close my eyes, too afraid of what I might see if I did. The next morning, I reported what I had seen to my supervisor. I expected him to laugh it off, to tell me I was just tired or that my mind was playing tricks on me. But instead, he just nodded and told me to pack my things. My assignment was over. I didn't argue. I was more than happy to leave Pine Ridge behind, to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. But the memory of that figure, of those black, empty eyes, has stayed with me. I've heard other rangers talk about Pine Ridge since then, about the strange things they've seen or felt in those woods. Some of them have even mentioned the figure, though none of them have gotten as close to it as I did. The stories all vary, but they share one common theme. Pine Ridge is a place that defies explanation, a place where the natural world intersects with something darker, something that doesn't belong. So if you ever find yourself near Pine Ridge, do yourself a favor and stay away. Don't venture into the hollow. Don't follow the trails that lead deeper into the woods, because once you see the shadow in the pines, it will never let you go. I had been a park ranger for almost 7 years when I was assigned to a remote section of the park known as the Lake of Lost Souls. The name alone was enough to send shivers down my spine, but I didn't have much choice in the matter. The assignment was supposed to be temporary, just a week of patrolling the area while the usual ranger was on leave. Little did I know that week would haunt me for the rest of my life. The lake was tucked away in a secluded corner of the park, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. Few visitors ventured that far out, partly because of the distance and partly because of the lake's sinister reputation. Over the years, there had been several reports of people disappearing near the lake: hikers, campers, even a couple of rangers. The stories were always the same. They would go down to the water's edge, and then they were gone, leaving behind only their belongings and an unsettling silence. It was late November when I arrived, the air crisp and the sky overcast. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The lake itself was shrouded in a thick layer of mist, the water so still that it resembled a sheet of glass. There was something about that place that felt wrong from the moment I set foot there, an oppressive atmosphere that weighed heavily on my chest. My first day was uneventful. I spent most of it checking the trails, making sure the signs were still visible and the paths clear. There was no sign of any visitors, and the forest was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. By the time the sun began to set, I was more than ready to head back to the small cabin that served as my temporary base. That night, as I settled into the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was a sensation that gnawed at the edges of my mind, making it impossible to relax. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and I could hear the creaking of the old wooden structure as it shifted in the cold. Despite my exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily. Sometime around midnight, I was jolted awake by a sound outside, a soft, rhythmic splashing, like something moving in the water. I lay there for a moment, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound continued, growing louder, more deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, then cautiously made my way to the door. The night was pitch black, the moon hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin, and pointed the flashlight toward the lake. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the mist that clung to the water's surface. But there was nothing there, just the inky blackness of the lake, stretching out into the distance. The splashing had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stood there for a few moments, scanning the shoreline, but I saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, an intense, almost suffocating presence that pressed in on me from all sides. I was about to head back inside when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing at the edge of the lake, partially obscured by the mist. I whipped the flashlight toward it, but by the time the beam hit the spot, the figure was gone. I spent the rest of the night on high alert, every creak and gust of wind sending my heart racing. But nothing else happened, and when the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The next day, I decided to investigate the area around the lake more thoroughly. I combed the shoreline, looking for any signs of disturbance, but found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there. It was as if the figure I had seen the night before had simply vanished into thin air. As the day wore on, the weather took a turn for the worse. The wind picked up, and dark clouds began to roll in, threatening rain. I knew I should head back to the cabin, but something kept pulling me toward the lake, a strange compulsion that I couldn't quite explain. I reached the water's edge just as the first raindrops began to fall, the mist swirling around my feet. The lake was even more foreboding in the daylight, the water an impenetrable black, as if it absorbed all light. I stood there for a moment, staring out at the water, when I heard it again, the splashing, louder this time, more frantic. I shone my flashlight across the lake, and that's when I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, rising from the water. They were translucent, almost ghostly, their faces twisted in expressions of pain and fear. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. They reached out toward me, their arms elongated and skeletal, as if begging for help. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. But the figures kept coming, their movements slow but relentless. I turned and ran, the rain now pouring down, drenching me to the bone. The forest seemed to close in around me as I fled, the trees blurring together in the storm. I could hear the figures behind me, their splashing footsteps growing louder, closer. I didn't stop running until I reached the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. I stood there, gasping for breath, drenched and terrified. The sound of the rain pounding on the roof was deafening, but I could still hear the faint splashing outside, the figures moving closer. I grabbed the radio and frantically called for help, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what I had seen. The dispatcher on the other end sounded confused, but he promised to send someone out as soon as possible. I knew it would be hours before anyone could reach me, and I wasn't sure I could last that long. I spent the next few hours huddled in the corner of the cabin, the rifle clutched in my hands. The rain continued to pour, and the wind howled outside, but the splashing never stopped. It was as if the figures were circling the cabin, waiting for me to come out. When the rescue team finally arrived the next morning, they found me still sitting in the corner, soaked and shivering, my eyes wide with terror. I tried to tell them what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was point to the lake, my hand trembling. They searched the area, but found nothing, no figures, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. The lake was as still and silent as ever, the mist hanging low over the water. The team chalked it up to stress and exhaustion, insisting that I had just imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I had seen. Those figures were real, and they were still out there, waiting. I was transferred out of the park the next day, and I've never been back to Pine Ridge since. But the memory of that night haunts me. The image of those tortured souls rising from the water, their hollow eyes pleading for help. The Lake of Lost Souls is a place where the past lingers, where the restless dead are trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. So if you ever find yourself near Pine Ridge, stay away from the lake. Don't be tempted by its still waters, and don't listen to the whispers that come from the mist. Because once you've seen the lost souls, there's no escaping their grasp. There's a place deep in the national park where the land dips into a narrow valley, a place that even the most seasoned park rangers try to avoid. The locals call it the Echo Valley, but not because of any acoustic phenomenon. The name comes from the strange sounds, voices, whispers, and sometimes screams that seem to come out of nowhere, bouncing off the rock walls and trees. I had heard the stories, but as a ranger, you're trained to dismiss that kind of thing as superstition. That all changed when I had to spend 3 days patrolling Echo Valley, and I realized that some legends hold more truth than you'd expect. It was late fall when my supervisor told me I'd be covering the Echo Valley route. The ranger who normally handled that section had taken leave unexpectedly. I didn't ask why. I should have. The hike down into the valley was rough. The trail hadn't been maintained in years, and it was barely visible under the blanket of fallen leaves. The trees were gnarled and ancient, their branches twisted like they'd been tormented by the wind for centuries. They grew so closely together that even in the daylight the forest felt like it was in a constant state of twilight. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of wet earth and decay. It didn't feel like any other part of the park. Something about it felt off. I arrived at the small ranger outpost at the bottom of the valley by mid-afternoon. It was just a cabin, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it was supposed to serve as my base for the next 3 days. As soon as I set my pack down inside, I heard the first echo. It was a voice, distant but clear, coming from somewhere outside. At first I thought it might be another ranger or maybe a hiker, but when I stepped outside there was no one. "Hello?" I called out, but the only answer was the wind rustling through the trees. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just the sound of the wind, and got to work checking the trail markers and making sure the paths were clear. The light was already starting to fade, and the valley grew darker quicker than I'd expected. By the time I made my way back to the cabin, it felt like night had already settled in. The first night passed quietly enough, though I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up to the sound of those strange voices, like they were coming from just outside the cabin. Every time I checked, though, there was nothing. No movement, no signs of anyone. But the feeling of being watched was constant. On the second day, I ventured deeper into the valley. There was an old hiking trail that led through a dense section of the forest, up toward a ridge that overlooked the park. I figured It would give me a good vantage point to check for any signs of trespassers or poachers. The deeper I went into the forest, the stronger the voices became. At first, it was just murmurs, too faint to make out. But as I climbed the ridge, the murmurs grew louder, clearer, like they were following me. Help, a voice whispered, and I stopped dead in my tracks. It wasn't the kind of sound that could be easily dismissed as the wind or animals. It was a human voice, and it was coming from somewhere ahead of me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the top of the ridge, I scanned the area, looking for any signs of people. The view was incredible, miles of forest stretching out in all directions, but there was no one there. The valley below was empty, the only movement coming from the wind through the trees. But then the voice came again, closer this time. Please help me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the thick underbrush. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a figure standing just at the edge of the light, barely visible through the trees. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall, gaunt, and his clothes were torn and filthy, like he'd been wandering the woods for days. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes, there was something wrong with his eyes. They were empty, hollow, like they were staring through me rather than at me. "Are you all right?" I called out, but the man didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me. I took a step forward, but as soon as I did, the figure disappeared into the shadows, vanishing so quickly that it was like he had never been there at all. My skin prickled with cold, and a wave of nausea washed over me. Something wasn't right. I made my way back down the ridge as fast as I could, the feeling of being followed growing stronger with each step. By the time I reached the bottom, it was nearly dark, and the valley was bathed in a thick fog that seemed to have rolled in out of nowhere. That night was worse than the first. The voices were louder, more persistent, and they didn't stop. They came from all directions outside the cabin, inside the cabin, even from underneath the floorboards. It was like they were closing in on me, whispering things I couldn't understand, taunting me. By the third day, I was on edge, running on almost no sleep and barely holding it together. The forest seemed to be alive, moving and shifting around me as I patrolled the trails. Every shadow felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. Around noon, I reached a clearing near the edge of the valley. There was an old, dilapidated cabin there, something from a time long before the park was established. I'd heard stories about it from other rangers, rumors that it was cursed, that something terrible had happened there, though no one knew exactly what. Most of them avoided it, but I was desperate for answers. I had to know what was happening in the valley. As I approached the cabin, the voices grew louder, but this time they were different. They weren't whispers anymore, they were screams, blood-curdling, agonized screams that sent chills down my spine. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the old, rusted handle. Every instinct I had was telling me to turn back, to leave the valley, and to never return. But I couldn't. I had to know. I pushed the door open, and the smell hit me immediately. Damp wood, rot, and something else, something metallic and sharp, blood. The inside of the cabin was dark and decayed, the floorboards creaking under my weight as I stepped inside. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that looked ancient, like something out of an old occult book. In the center of the room was a large wooden table, and on it lay a pile of bones, human bones. I backed away, my heart racing. I needed to get out of there, but as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut on its own, trapping me inside. The screams intensified, filling the cabin, echoing off the walls until it felt like my skull was going to split open. I pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. The air in the cabin grew colder, and I could feel a presence behind me, something dark and malevolent. I turned slowly, and there, standing in the center of the room, was the same figure I had seen on the ridge. Only now there were more of them, dozens of figures, all gaunt and hollow-eyed. Their faces twisted in anguish, they reached out to me, their bony fingers brushing against my skin. Cold as death, I screamed, but no sound came out. The cabin began to spin, the walls closing in, and I felt myself being pulled down, deeper and deeper into the darkness. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground outside the cabin, the morning sun shining through the trees. My radio crackled to life, and I heard my supervisor's voice calling my name. I tried to respond, but my voice was weak, barely a whisper. It took them hours to find me, and when they did, I was delirious, muttering about the voices and the figures. I was airlifted out of the valley that afternoon, and I haven't been back since. No one believed my story. Of course, they said I must have gotten lost, that the stress and lack of sleep had caused me to hallucinate. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. Echo Valley is haunted, and whatever is down there doesn't want to be disturbed. So if you ever find yourself near the valley, stay away, because once you hear the echoes, they'll never leave you.